Gerard, The Ghosts of Culloden Moor, Book 15, written by L. Muir, narrated by Andrew McDermott and Jenn McGuirk. Chapter 1. Culloden Moor Night. It had happened too suddenly. Only after Kennedy had disappeared from the moor, along with Sansouret's strange uncle, did Gerard think to protest. He'd been distracted when the other man had been able to lay hands on Kennedy and not slip through her, and by the time Gerard had opened his mouth and taken a step, the two were gone. Sonny gave him a wink, then headed back to her bonfire with purpose in her stride, and he was left with empty air to argue with. Was he the only one anxious to know what had happened to Nessa Kennedy and the man who had taken her from the moor in a blink of an eye, when even God himself hadn't managed to do so for the past 269 years? He had no problem trusting Sonny, though she was only 16 years of age, but trusting her dark uncle was much more difficult. There was something unsettling about a man who could do such miraculous things without so much as a blink of his eye. Grumbling his thoughts as he went, he wandered back into the midst of his fellow ghosts and waited with the rest, stomping at the rain puddles and having no more effect on them than the breeze. Mortal again, for a day or two, able to stomp puddles and send the rain splashing. All fine and well, but what he truly wished for was the chance to feel and be felt, and the vague visage of a Scottish lass named Assa wavered before his mind's eye. Assa, from Dingwall, he remembered now. After the centuries, he should have forgotten such a small detail, but the short experience he'd shared with the young woman had never left him. Or at least not for long. Assa from Dingwall. Though he would never mention it to another of the 79, for a certainty they would mock him, he'd always had a sense that the woman was with him somehow, as if he crossed her mind from time to time while she lived, and after 100 years, when he still felt her watching over him, he reasoned she would have to be watching from heaven itself. Did she wait for him? If he accepted his challenge and went forth from Culloden to perform some heroic deed, he'd be granted the chance to have an audience with the prince. But how much more would he prefer a meeting with the woman who ruled over his heart? Assa from Dingwall. Sonny's voice rose and he took notice. The last of the McGregor brothers was called next. A busy night then. As soon as Liam McGregor's plaid arse was gone, the bonfire spit a few high flames, then fizzled and disappeared just as cleanly as Nessa Kennedy had. Ah, Kennedy. A restless lass to be sure. Hundreds of times he tried to speak with that spirit, to encourage her to join the rest of them from time to time, in hopes some of that restlessness would ease. But she'd practically run from him. If he happened to be close by and turned to her suddenly, she would gasp and disappear as if she were one of those balloon toys poked with a pin. The only thing lacking was the pop. No, Kennedy hadn't wished to speak with him or the rest. But thankfully she'd found a friend in the young lad, Robbie. With both of them now gone, however, Culloden Moor seemed to him a much lonelier place. He'd grown partial to her keeping a wary eye on him, albeit from afar. Along with the rest, he turned away from the gallery and sought a bit of peace from the excitement of the evening.
Gerard Ross.
Sonny's voice rang out and stopped him. Knee-deep, but unaffected by a deep pool of melted snow, he turned and waited. Sonny came to him. The green ring of light that swirled around her glowed brighter as she neared, as if lighting her way. Unnecessary, surely, as Sonny must have known Culloden's fields well enough to need no light.
In 2 weeks' time,
She said, panting from the sudden run.
I'll be back for you 2 weeks from now. Be ready, Gerard. After that, you'll no longer be known as number 57.
I'll be ready, he told the lass. In truth, I am ready now. Sonny shrugged as a grin bloomed across her beguiling face. Her rapid breath came in bursts of frosted air.
Oh, but she is not ready yet.
Then, with a wink and a wave, the wee witch was off to the car park. She tucked her long black robe and her green light into a wee white vehicle and left without a look back. She... Chapter 2. It was a rare thing for Gerard to notice the passing of time. For centuries he'd awakened and slept at the whim of the wind. The only reason he'd known how much time had passed was because the visitors changed, along with their newspapers and their garb. He never grew weary, never needed physical rest, and until Sonny came along nearly 16 years before, he'd rarely been compelled by much at all. The moor itself changed now and again. The building of the great visitor centre had disturbed his peace, but had also brought a bit of entertainment, and when folks started carrying around their mobile devices, he'd learned just how much the world had changed while he'd been lurking about. For the past 2 weeks, however, he'd been acutely aware of every passing hour, minute and second, thanks to that teasing wee witch. She, indeed. Who was this woman who needed to prepare before his quest could begin, and what exactly needed preparing? She. Was she someone he had known from his mortal life? He'd sorted through every memory he could summon, but damned if he'd been able to think of more than half a dozen faces, including his own mother and Gran. Then he'd pushed those possibilities aside, for all 6 of those had surely passed from the earth more than 200 years before. Unfortunately, that lot included the mysterious Assa. When he considered the measureless time he'd spent upon the moor in spirit form, he could think of only 2 instances where a woman had caught his attention, but only because they'd sported thick heads of red curling hair like Assa's. Once he'd studied their faces to see if the woman's ghost had come looking for him, he'd never given them a second thought. His memory of her exact features was long gone. However, if Assa herself stood before him, he was certain he would know her. She. If she was not from his mortal lifetime and not from his spirit life, then she must needs be someone new, someone he had yet to meet. Would this she be a damsel in some distress? Or would she be a wee lassie who needs a helping hand a bit stronger than the average man's? While Gerard stood near the Linnock cottage watching the sun seek its rest for the night, he glanced down at his hands. Large, yes, a bit on the hairy side, but not frighteningly so. A wee lass would do well trusting in his hands. Well-formed arms, heavy with muscle, that was, if gravity had any pull on him. A strong back and legs, aye, quick feet when needed, and a keen eye for danger. He nodded to himself. If he were a lass in need of aid, he would consider himself lucky to have the assistance of a fine, braw warrior like Gerard Ross. I wonder... Gerard turned to see Watson materialise with his arse leaned against the nearest tree, and he groaned. Since they'd witnessed a film called Sherlock Holmes and the Hound of the Baskervilles, the bothersome man had taken upon himself the mannerisms of a fictional character, also named Watson, who was an assistant to a clever detective. For the past 3 decades, the ghost Watson had poked his nose where it never belonged, sure there was a mystery to be solved every time a bloody bee buzzed across a patch of heather. Gerard braced himself for a lengthy analysis, but then realised a drawn-out exchange with the busybody might help pass the time while he waited for Sonny's promised visit. "What is it you wonder, 71? He couldn't believe he was actually inviting the man into a conversation, but he was desperate for distraction. Watson smirked, pushing away from the tree, then began pacing a wide circuit around him. I was just trying to justify why the mighty Gerard Ross was suddenly so taken with his own form. For whom would you be preening at this time of? He glanced at the trees to the west, beyond which the sun had disappeared. This time of evening. Gerard shrugged. An inventory is a wise thing every now and again. Watson nodded in a maybe sort of way. Worried you might be going too fat? Then he laughed. Gerard tried to laugh along, but he was far too nervous for such inanities. The other ghost gestured toward Gerard's hand that fidgeted and tapped the side of his kilt. Gerard immediately ceased the twitching and folded his arms. Nervous, too. Watson shook his head. Preening and nervous, not like ye, Ross. Gerard was just about to suggest the man go burrow back into his grave and count his bones when he was distracted by the flash of a light. A car pulled down the drive. It was the same white colour Sonny had driven 2 nights before, but after a quick turn, the car drove away again, obviously realising the great visitor centre was closed for the night. Interesting, Watson remarked. But Gerard was in no mood for the other ghost's nonsense. If it were Nessa Kennedy watching him so closely, he wouldn't mind a bit. But Watson... Gerard closed the distance between them, and as he was about to pass 71, he paused just long enough to throw his fist through the other ghost's head. Nothing connected. There was no satisfying smack or vibration from the contact, but it was enough to give Watson his encouragement to go to hell. Chapter 3. As soon as it was fully dark, a heavy fog marched silently and smoothly onto the fields like a gathering army. Some of Gerard's comrades took note and slipped away as if they were in no mood for such ominous portents. Others never noticed at all when their own ghostly figures were erased by a steadily moving cloud of something slightly more substantial than themselves. But there was one spirit who stood in the centre of the battlefield with his hands on his hips, his chin high, and a scowl on his forehead that would likely frighten the mist away if only it had a pair of eyes to see his formidable visage. Number 79, Simon McLaren. The ghost had been spoiling for a fight since the night of the first gathering, when Sonny had called them all together and announced she would, indeed, be sending them on to the hereafter, whether they willed it or no. She and McLaren had argued over her plan, the details of which the big blonde seemed to understand more than the rest of them. But no matter how he'd begged her, the lass had been determined to see her plan through. McLaren hadn't taken his defeat well, and it was lucky for the lot of them that the big man couldn't do any more damage to them than Gerard had done a wee while ago to Watson. Otherwise, they'd be licking their wounds once again. And now the ghost was taking issue with the mist. Perhaps he is finally going mad, Gerard thought, though a more unnatural mist he had never seen upon the moor before. Then he wondered if McLaren knew something more than he did. His instincts told him to clear his mind and slip away like many others had done, and he would have, were it not for the fact that Sonny was coming for him. Forbes strode past his right shoulder, shaking his head, murmuring to himself, "The lass would be foolish to be out in such a fog. We'll not see her this night." Jared's chest tightened. He hoped 17 was wrong, that Sonny would come. But at the same time, he hoped she was wise enough not to venture out onto dangerous roads for the sake of dead men. The fog stomped past McLaren in spite of his scowl, and the big man's head dropped to his chest just as he disappeared into the opaque wall. A long minute later, the vapour came for Gerard and the great visitor centre beyond. It swallowed him like a great dust storm, and he marvelled at the immediate and shocking sense of being somewhere other than the battlefield. White in all directions, and beyond the white, anything at all. From the right he heard hissing and turned towards it, fearless but wary. A subdued green glow the size of a fist grew to become a low horizontal smear in the clouds before him. His heart leaped. Sonny had come just as she'd promised. She hissed at him again.
"Gerard Ross, are you there?"
Her face emerged as if from the depths of a smoky mirror and grinned at him.
"I'll not have the others looking on, aye? For the question I am about to ask you, many will not be asked."
"Ye summoned the fog, then?" She nodded with a touch of pride.
"I did, indeed. How can I ever have a private word with Simon McLaren with all of ye gawking?"
Jared laughed, knowing the big blonde's mood would soon change. "Then it was not dangerous for ye to come." Her reply was a light laugh and a wink. And with that worry out of the way, he remembered the questions that had plagued him every moment for the past 2 weeks. "I've a question or two, Sansoray."
"Your questions will be answered in due time, but my query is this. If you had the whole of the world to choose from, Gerard Ross, where would you go?"
"Dingwall." The answer jumped from his mouth before he had time to consider. He had once hoped to search out a lass in the city of Dingwall if the Battle of Culloden Moor would have gone the other way. But he'd given up that hope soon after the opening volley, and since Assa of Dingwall must surely have met her death a full 200 years ago, there was no need to look for her, unless he wished to glimpse a stone with her name engraved upon it. He snorted. He didn't know the lass's surname. He could trip and fall face first on her grave and never know if it was truly hers. But even then, to what end? As ghost or man, what good could he be to her now? And still, with all the world to choose from, he could not deny that Dingwall was where his heart still wished to go. Sonny emitted a strange little sound that could only mean she was delighted with his answer. Then she cleared her throat, put a serious mask on her features, and nodded.
"Very well then, Dingwall it is."
An irrepressible grin had just begun its escape when Sonny and her beloved dimples disappeared altogether, and in their place was the old, deeply creased face of a well-aged woman who had fallen asleep seated upright on a bus bench. Her chin rested on twisted old hands that were, in turn, resting on the handle of a long black cane. Finding himself on his knees before the old woman, Gerard's nose was less than a foot away from the swollen one covered with spots of age. He decided to back away carefully and not wake her, but he was startled to find himself breathing real air into his lungs again, and his gasp brought the old eyes open with a snap. Chapter 4.
"Och, you're a handsome devil, you are,"
the ancient woman said. Her lips had long since faded of any blush, and if there were teeth hidden behind them, Gerard saw none. Her voice was little more than a rasp of dry wind over drier leaves, but it was so foreign a sensation to be seen by a mortal other than his sonny, he could not move.
And if you be Lucifer, I'd sorely be tempted to follow you anywhere.
Her cheeks plumped into rosy orbs, and she laughed. The delightful sound broke the spell, and he was able to stand. Then he bowed. "'Tis a lucky thing I'm not heathen, for I would spirit ye away in a trice, take back every tear you've shed, and lay the world at your feet, lassie."
Ooh!
She whooped and cackled like a seabird.
Lassie, he says.
Then she looked him over from head to toe and blushed again.
I do hope your own lass appreciates your blindness, love.
He plucked up her bony hands in his and kissed the backs of each. "My own lass, ye say? Do you mean to tell me I've mistaken the two of ye?" She pulled her hands away and held them up to her hot cheeks.
Away with you, laddie. The doctor will wonder what's got my heart to racing, and I'm too modest a maid to explain it.
Gerard laughed and looked about him. "Then direct me to the kirk, lass, so I might bend the vicar's ear."
Oh!
The woman shook her head and pointed down the road toward the Crumity Firth in the distance.
Castle Street.
She resumed, muttering to herself.
Bend his ear, he says.
Then she started cackling again like an excited hen. Worried both for the woman's heart and the attention her laughter might attract, Gerard gave her a wink and went on his way. The smell of the Firth was unmistakable, and it stopped him in his tracks. He could smell again. And with that smell came the taste of heather and broom. The pines covering the highlands to the west might have been chopped up for a stew and poured over his tongue. The scent of them was that strong. "God bless ye, Sonsoray. God bless ye." And if nothing ever came of this gift of a mortal day, at least he was able to remember what it had once felt like to be alive. His stomach rumbled, but he had a stronger hunger at the moment, and it would need a bit of satisfaction before he worried over finding a meal and a way to pay for it. The Church of Scotland stood on Castle Street as promised, though he was surprised by how many other churches he passed on his way to it. His kilt seemed to attract a great deal of attention, but it only reminded him that he was alive and visible. So he met curious stares with a generous smile and a wave of his hand. "Would you look at that git? He's throwing his own parade." Gerard turned his head and spied a big blond fellow standing at a petrol station filling his lorry and smirking at him. Another man stood in the back of the truck and laughed. A third man sat inside the vehicle and grinned at his friend's words. The slight lift of that one's chin was an invitation for a fight, and though Gerard ached for the feel of a bone cracking beneath his fist, that happy event was even further down his list of wishes than was food. So he blew the trio a collective kiss and moved on, waving and smiling at passers-by with all the more cheer, just to prove he would not lower his mood to please them. Finally, when he stood at the top of the kirk steps, he paused. Still feeling the trio's eyes upon him, he glanced back. The lorry was now on the road and coming his way, so he waited until just the right moment, bent and flipped the back of his kilt up off his bum. A mooning, they called it. He was rewarded with the loud blaring of a horn and a pair of quiet gasps. He straightened and turned. Two ladies with matching clothes and faces teetered on the steps behind him, their eyes wide, brows as high as the blush on their cheeks. He hurried to them and offered each an arm. "Beg pardon," he mumbled, and in the distance he heard the high peal of laughter from the disappearing lorry. After only a slight hesitation, the ladies clamped onto his arms and allowed him to escort them inside. A half-dozen apologies later, he finally felt forgiven and excused himself to search out the vicar. But one sister was slow to release his arm.
I have a beautiful neighbour lass you simply must meet.
He chuckled. Had I the time, madam, I would love nothing more, but as it is,
Time? Dear me.
said the second sister, staring at him with calculating eyes that mirrored the first one.
How much time do you need to slip down the street and have a pint?
A pint, you say?
Our treat, of course.
He frowned, uncomfortable with the idea of a woman paying for a drink, even if he were dying of thirst in the middle of the Sahara.
Call it a bribe.
Said the first. Then the pair of them laughed. He shook his head. I must speak to the vicar, ladies, and I dinna ken how long it might take. The pair agreed to wait for him at the Isle Norse Hall, a pub at the far end of the street nearest the Firth, as long as he agreed to come straight away after he finished with the vicar. He gave his word, and the females finally let him be. He found the young, scrawny vicar in the kirkyard, trying to straighten a heavy stone cross whose corner had sunk into the ground half a foot deep, and threatened to topple onto another equally ancient-looking stone. Both markers were so old the names and dates had worn nearly off. All but the words daughter was illegible on the cross. The Celtic design in the centre was accentuated with bright green moss. Gerard asked the young man about the parish records while he pushed the cross in the opposite direction from which it tilted. He held the corner aloft while the vicar filled the empty space with rocks and dirt and answered between shovelfuls. I'm sorry to say, the years you're looking for were sadly neglected. When it came to recording births, none were recorded, or the records were lost. From the years 1721 to 1742, and the death records in the old parochial registers don't begin until 1786. Gerard refused to give up hope. What of marriages? The man's face brightened, and he set the shovel aside. Aye, 1753 to 1854 we have. They lowered the stone into place, but the newly resurrected side stood a bit higher. The vicar gestured at it with his chin. First rain will see it all straight again. God will see to it, aye, just as he sent you to my aid just now. They moved back inside the kirk to finish their conversation. The vicar washed the soil from his hands and sweat from his brow and neck. Then they stepped into a small room that served as the man's kitchen. He poured them both a drink of water and apologized for not having anything stronger to offer. You say this woman would have been born around 1725 or later? Gerard nodded and tried not to act too excited about a woman who had lived so long ago. Aye. So, she wouldn't be in our marriage records unless she married after she was 30. And back then, that wasn't likely. But a look. He patted Gerard's arm. What was the woman's name? Embarrassed, Gerard shrugged. I only knew her name was Assa, from Dingwall. Well, said the vicar, I hope ye didn't come far to find her, what without a clan name at least. Nay, he said, not far at all, only from the bus stop up the way. As it happened, there were two women named Assa whose marriages had been recorded in the parochial registers between 1753 and 1854. But one had been a mere 16-year-old, and the other 21. Neither could have been his red-haired love. He thanked the vicar for his attention and stepped out into a rare ray of sunshine. But disappointment hit him like the cool breeze blowing off the Firth. He might have appeared as cheerful as the July sun, but his heart was heavy as a rain-soaked cloud. The chances had been slim, slimmer than slim, truth be told, but apparently his subconscious mind had gotten its hopes up. The lass had been so memorable, He'd almost expected a legend of some sort about Assa from Dingwall. A monument, perhaps, to a brave lass who had saved her kin and clan from some catastrophe, and all with a wee dagger she'd hidden in her boot. But if her name meant nothing to the vicar, who else might he ask? He remembered the old woman at the bus stop, and kicked himself for not wondering why Sonny's magic had placed him there before her. If he'd have asked her, would she have known some tale? Perhaps known of an ancestor with a name from Irish mythology. If anyone would know of her, it would be the elders of Dingwall, and it just so happened he had an appointment to meet with two busy, matchmaking women who could surely identify the town's oldest storytellers. Their accents had been more American than Scots, but no matter. Even if they hadn't lived in Dingwall for long, they would know. And they'd offered him a pint besides. The cool wind whipped around him and urged him down the steps, though he needed no more urging, and rather than wish it away, he appreciated the chance to feel cold once again. He was alive. Alive, and given one more chance to learn what might have become of lovely Assa, where she had lived, whom she had loved. And afterwards he could help his fellow mortals with some heroic deed. If he did earn a boon, he would demand to know what had become of Nessa Kennedy. It still bothered him that Sonny's dark uncle had been able to touch the lass just before the pair of them had disappeared from the moor, and even though Gerard had never seen any of the other ghosts after they'd left on their quests, he wanted reassurance that Kennedy was safe. His worry was foolish, he knew, but just the same it was the boon he would request, and be damned to the bonny prince. Oh, how his fellow ghosties would mock him if they knew he was spending his precious mortal hours worrying over the fates of two women long dead. Chapter 5. Assa picked up the coffee pot and headed back to the small table near the door of the Isle-Norse Hall. Her neighbours, the Muir sisters, had been sipping coffee and nibbling on scones for nearly an hour. They were waiting for someone, they said, so she hadn't bothered them. But Assa was sure their coffees were cold.
"Let me heat up your cups,"
she said, and topped off both.
"Are you sure your friend is coming? I could have Jackie start you something in the kitchen." "No, dear. We'll wait for the young man, if it's all the same." "No hurry then. If I don't notice him come in, give me a shout."
Loretta laughed.
"Oh, you're sure to notice."
Lorraine elbowed her sister, then smiled at Assa.
"We'll flag you down."
Assa took the hot pot back to its cradle and walked the length of the long bar, where she could continue into the kitchen or turn left to wait on tables. But that day, other than the Muir twins, only one other table was occupied, and by the same crew who always occupied it. Her cousins sat around the back corner table where the light was dim and argued with Jackie, her brother and housecook. Their conversation stopped short as she neared them. She pretended not to think their argument had anything to do with her.
"Don't like your food today, cousins? Would you like the cook to make you something else?"
Jackie snorted. "They'll eat it, or they'll wear it." He gave the other three a pointed look, and they all chuckled together. It was a fact Jackie was a fine cook and rarely had a complaint. But the cooking wasn't the most important thing on the menu for the folks of Dingwall. The liquor was, and they weren't too particular about that, at least not after the first few drinks. Hughie lifted a concerned brow. "Are you feeling well, cousin?"
"Aye, I'm grand, but it won't be for long, if folks keep asking how I'm feeling, you ken."
The others nodded and bit their lips as if they'd been tempted to ask her the same, and she levelled a glare around the table.
If I feel another coma coming on, I'll be sure to raise an alarm. Will that do?
Jackie frowned at his hands and nodded. You'd worry too if one of us had just escaped the grave. He jumped in his seat a little and caught his breath. Ian, the largest and blondest of the three cousins, had kicked her brother beneath the table.
Escape the grave indeed.
She rolled her eyes.
I took a well-earned nap is all. You act as if I was unconscious for a decade, not a week. And my memory is improving by the minute.
4 faces turned to her with wide eyes.
I ken what worries you,
she said with narrowed eyes, which only alarmed them more.
You fear the day I remember which one of you is responsible for the fight that landed me in hospital, am I right?
Jamie looked the most guilty before he went back to eating his fish and chips. His brothers followed his lead, and Jackie slid out of the booth. Good thing the crowd is light today, he said, no doubt to change the subject. It was kind of ye to take the afternoon shift, sister, but I'm sorry to see ye have to deal with the Muirs. Assa shook her head.
The Muirs don't bother me. I'm sorry they make the rest of you nervous. But I'm sure when they're 100 years each, folks will call them witches.
Jackie nodded. Don't let them fool ye, they're witches now. She laughed only because he'd said it with such conviction, but they both caught their breath when both sisters turned to look at them.
You don't suppose they heard you?
She asked him, then laughed when she realised her brother had taken the bait. He gave her a dirty look, then stumped off to the kitchen. She laughed and went behind the bar to see what cleaning she could do in the lull. She'd been lying, of course. Her memory wasn't improving by the minute. It had been a long 2 weeks since they'd taken her out of the hospital, and she'd be damned if she could remember much of her life at all. She'd recognised Jackie and their cousins. The house had felt familiar, but not the hazelnut orchards that surrounded it. She had no recollection at all of the work she'd done to keep the company running, but she had an assistant who had no problem taking care of things until Assa's memory returned. It was all so frustrating, like she'd stepped into a depressing movie, except for the little flashes of dreams that slipped into her mind throughout the day. The doctors said it was normal, and that those flashes would eventually go away. But what if she didn't want them to? That was the question that upset her the most. It made her wonder if she had hated her life so much that, subconsciously, she would prefer the life she'd spent wandering through dreams. Though she had lost her parents and younger brother, which she couldn't remember clearly, she had still been surrounded by loving family. She had a successful business to give her purpose in life, and she was still young enough to have a family if the right man came along. But there was something missing from the pretty picture of a life she'd awakened to. Unfortunately, that missing something might be a missing someone. And that missing someone only lived in those coma-induced dreams. So how could that be? Was he real, or was he imagined? And if he were real, why was he not there with her? Why did none of the boys mention him? And if he were imagined, what good was he to her real, though temporarily forgotten, life? Surely she would go mad trying to reconcile it all. Assa suppressed a sigh as she reached for a bin beneath the counter. Her cousins had finished eating and were preparing to leave, and she was glad there would be some dishes to wash. Ian stepped into the back while his brothers waited at the bar, so she hurried to bus the abandoned table. Just as she rounded the bar again, Ian stepped out of the kitchen using the wrong door, and she had to sidestep to keep from crashing into him. In the midst of the chaos, the bell clanged above the front door, but it wasn't Ian's sudden appearance that caused her to drop the bin and send dishes and utensils crashing. It was the Highlander who had stepped directly from her subconscious into the Owl Nordic Hall. His silhouette, his kilt, even the way he planted his fists on his hips and surveyed the place like he owned every inch of it, was much more familiar to her than her own bedroom. He was here. The crash drew the man's attention, and his head turned toward her. He took a step and cocked his head, as if waiting for his eyes to adjust. Then something registered. His hands left his hips and reached out to her. He fell to his knees and gasped her name, as if he hadn't expected her to be there at all. Assa! Chapter 6. A few minutes before. Gerard's steps weren't nearly so light after leaving the kirk. He still held out hope that some old-timer might have heard Assa's name before, but he braced himself for another disappointment. What would it matter, truly? Whether or not he found dates marking her life, whether or not he discovered her last name, she had lived, and he had been witness to it. Though he'd forgotten much of their conversations, he clearly remembered holding her in his arms, kissing her lips. And together they'd played the doting newlyweds for a pair of nosy redcoats. Then he'd left her. Heaven help him, he could still see her standing in the shadows of the larder, holding her breath as he chose Culloden's almost certain death over remaining with her. Though the features on her face were no longer as clear as they had been for the first 100 years of his haunting, that shadowed image had never left him. Assa of Dingwall. Perhaps he shouldn't have requested Dingwall as a destination after all. With such a distraction on his mind, he might miss the opportunity he'd been sent for. Or perhaps there was no specific deed awaiting him. If he found no one in Dingwall to help, he might look for a boat in need of a strong back and work his way to another port. It might be refreshing to feel the motion of the sea beneath his mortal feet again. He looked toward the firth for such a boat, but instead of waves he saw nothing but a thick, gathering fog blocking his view. A cold shiver ran up his spine, and he laughed. "Dingwall it is," he said quietly, just in case a certain wee witch was listening. A strange piece of construction stood at the end of the street. A bit apart from the other buildings, it was a cross between a church with arched walls and the hull of a large Viking ship set on its head. Though it had a stone facade, the rest of the pub was made from beams of wood, and if it weren't for a strange need to see what the inside of the place might look like, Gerard imagined the sight of it might put the average man off his drink. If ever there was a public house called the Owl Nordic Hall, this had to be it, though Nordic Hull would have been more appropriate. A small sign swung from a yardarm. Nordic was all he needed to see before opening the large wood door and stepping inside. After the bright sunshine, his eyes had trouble adjusting to the dim interior. The two women he'd come to meet were seated to his left at the nearest table, though all he could see of them were their matching hair, piled high on their heads, and their matching blue pantsuits that looked more at home in the previous century. He gave them a nod, but dared not move until he could see his footing. The long hall was divided in halves. The right half began with a long, shiny bar that ran a good 20 feet in a straight line. At the far end of the bar was a wide window high in the wall, with hints of a kitchen beyond. The left side was filled with booths along the wall, and a full row of tables staggered throughout the space between the booths and the bar. In the rear, beyond the booths, and opposite the kitchen, was an empty space meant for dancing, and a small riser in the corner for a musician or two. A tray of dishes exploded in the shadows beyond, though he couldn't see more than 15 feet in front of him. He reminded himself of the current year and resisted the urge to reach for a weapon that was no longer at his side anyway. The danger became apparent, however, when the forms of the 3 men from the lorry finally came into focus. There was a 4th figure behind the bar itself, but it was a woman. Her hair was full and curled, and from a light overhead, the colour caught at his heart. Copper red. It was her face, though, that dealt him a final blow. The memory he'd groped for, just beyond his reach, stared back at him. He groped for it again. That image, that face, those eyes. He willed himself forward, and quickly, afraid they would be lost to him before he committed them better to his memory. But his legs heard nothing, and his knees fell hard against the wood planks beneath him. "Assa," he said, begging the image to stay. "Assa." She took a step toward him, bless her, but an arm came around her and held her back. "Careful," the young man said. "There's broken glass." But his attention was not on the floor. The woman gave Gerard a long look. Then she bent, and he lost sight of her. The sound of clattering dishes told Gerard she hadn't disappeared. He sucked a few deep breaths of air into his lungs and found he could control his body again. He put one foot beneath him, and the big blonde fellow moved closer, with one hand held up. "I think it's safer for us all if you stay on your knees, aye. Harder to show us your arse from down there." Another man pushed his way around the first. "Well, if it isn't the hussy who likes to lift her skirts for everyone in town." Gerard grinned at that, not because the man was particularly funny, but because he knew an invitation to fight when he heard one. It didn't matter the century, these blokes were aching for a head-busting. And since the woman of Gerard's dreams was otherwise occupied for the moment, he was happy to oblige. By the time the lass returned to her feet, he was sure he could knock his 3 grinning friends off theirs. He plucked a brolly from the stand behind him, caught the second man across the jaw, then stood and put his other foot beneath him. Just in time he adjusted his weight so he could lean far back and avoid the blonde's first swing. So much momentum did the hammy fist have behind it, Gerard had time to swing the brolly again, knocking the other man's fist into the face of the third man, who had yet to insult him, but seemed eager to fight just the same. While the blonde tried to recover, Gerard used the pointy end of the brolly to nudge him backward, off balance, and onto his arse, without breaking so much as a chair in the place. It was then he heard the lass screaming,
"Stop it! Stop it! Leave them alone!"
She bounded around the corner of the bar and came to stand between himself and the blonde.
"Get out!"
One of the twins stood up and laid a hand on the lass's arm.
"But dear, this is the young man we were hoping. Get out!"
She repeated, and the woman backed away, though everyone knew she was talking to Gerard. The blonde chuckled. "You've missed in your own nest, your lordship." Gerard began backing for the door. "Who's that?" "Our Assa abhors violence." He stopped, dropped the brolly back in the stand and held up his hands in surrender. "May I say something?"
"Out!"
She widened her eyes a bit to show she was serious. He lowered his chin in defeat and turned to go, but he could feel her behind him, could almost hear her thoughts screaming at him, begging him to stay. So he spun on his heel and faced her with his back to the door. "I don't know how you got here, lass, but—"
"Go!"
"Will it make any difference if I've—"
"Not another word."
"Been madly in love with ye for centuries?" Still babying his jaw, the second man came forward. Gerard shook his upraised hand to remind him he had already surrendered, but he kept coming anyway. He finally left his jaw alone, plucked up the umbrella, and used the handle to push Gerard's chest hard, opening the door in the doing and removing him from the pub in the same motion. He allowed Gerard to step away without touching him. "If there's anything our cousin hates more than violence, it's a liar, so you'll have no luck here, mate. And if you upset her with any more of your silliness, you'll find yourself in a nice deep grave in a certain hazel orchard." Assa felt like a fool for coming apart like she had. The little skirmish was the first bit of violence she had witnessed since she'd been home from the hospital, and though she'd explained to the boys how she hated them fighting, she hadn't remembered just how much she hated it until she saw the Highlander strike Hughie. The memory of it still had her stomach turning. Her overprotective brother jostled her into Ian's lorry and ordered the cousins to take her home. She wasn't about to argue. Her head was spinning and competing against her stomach for her attention, and all she could think to do was to get home and force herself to sleep for a while. A wee lion was needed to quiet everything down. At the moment, she felt like someone was screaming in her head. She glanced up when they drove around the corner, and the mystery man in a kilt was still standing near the pub's front door. He turned his head and made eye contact, as if he had sensed her inside the truck. Was he a demon come to take her soul? She shuddered, even though the cab of the truck was hot from the sun. "Don't worry," Jamie said with a wink. "We'll keep you safe from headbangers like him. We're not going anywhere." She smiled and nodded, admitting she was grateful for that protection. But if the mysterious man was crazy, she worried she might be as well. Ian switched on the radio, and a slow song calmed her nerves a little. She tried to think of where she'd heard it before, and an image popped in her head of a young girl sitting on a stone bench at Culloden Moor, just outside the ancient cottage that still stood on the place. In the girl's hand was a pink iPod, attached to equally pink earphones. That was the first time Assa had heard the tune. She remembered it plainly, but in the picture, so clear in her head, Assa couldn't remember where she'd been standing. And if the girl were wearing earphones, how had Assa heard the song? Must have had the volume up high, she reckoned. But she suddenly didn't feel like listening to the rest of the song and changed the station. Jamie frowned at her. "That was weird though, wasn't it?"
What's that?
"How that bloke knew your name." "Jamie." Ian gave him a dark look, then turned his attention back to the road. Jamie shrugged. "Well, it's not like he could have been telling the truth. I mean, he couldn't have known her centuries ago, aye." Ian closed his eyes briefly, as if praying for patience, but said nothing. Assa nudged him with her shoulder.
"Danny Fash, I was thinking the same thing myself."
But she wouldn't share with the two warriors what was really bothering her. That she was pretty sure she knew the man's name too. The man who had walked straight out of her dreams. Ross. Deep in her bones, she was certain the man's name would be Ross. But how could she know it? Had she summoned him? Had her subconscious pulled him from her dreams, created him out of thin air, and delivered him to her? If so, it made the idea of going home to have a lie-in all the more interesting. Chapter 7. Gerard stood outside the strange building and hoped he hadn't disappointed Sansaray. It was a certainty he'd disappointed Assa, and his disappointment in himself came from upsetting her so terribly she hadn't wanted to hear him out. If only he'd known of her aversion to violence, he could have weathered any number of insults from her cousins. If he'd only known. He thought of the Assa he once knew, and a clear memory returned of the first time he'd laid eyes upon her. She'd been facing down a trio of villains, inviting them to shoot her. No aversion to violence then. And though she'd used no violence to try to keep him captive in that bedchamber at Dunvegan House, she'd certainly threatened it. It was strange, the memories that hurried to the surface just from the sight of her. Moments that had slipped beyond his reach were suddenly playing out as if they'd happened days ago, and with them came the emotions. He had to speak with her. But how could he get close enough without rousing the 4 bulldogs that guarded her? And even if he got past them, how could he earn her trust? Surely, if he could trigger her memory like she had triggered his, she would remember how they'd felt about each other at the end, and hopefully, for the little time he had left on the earth, they could make a few happy memories to add to the sadder ones. Dear, sweet Sonny must have delved deep into his heart to realize what he'd truly desired, for he never would have dared hope to see his Assa again. Had she also found a way to make Nessa Kennedy such a gift? He felt like a pure louse for thinking of another woman only moments after Assa had left his sight, but his thoughts caught on Nessa Kennedy again, like a sweater on a nail. 2 more opposite women there could never be, and yet Kennedy also held a piece of his heart. How could she not? Even from a distance, 3 centuries was a long time to spend near a lass and not become devoted in some way. The common man would never understand, but then again the common man knew nothing of ghostly matters. The door opened behind him, and the 2 sisters stepped outside. Neither of them appeared to be too ruffled by the earlier confrontation. They stood to either side of him and said nothing, waiting for him to speak first. "My apologies,"
Nonsense,
said the sister on his left.
we should apologize to you for inviting you here.
"I take it Assa is the neighbour you spoke of."
Oh yes, she's a lovely girl. We had no idea you'd met before, of course.
The sister on the right offered him an innocent smile. He nodded, then shook his head. "That is a bald lie." She bit her lip, but denied nothing. The one on his left gaped like a fish for a moment, then shrugged and gave up.
Please don't tell Sansaray.
That surprised him. "You ken Sansaray?" The left one nodded.
Our niece?
"Do ye ken who I?" Both sisters nodded.
She's spread herself so thin, you see. We must step in and help all we can.
"Then you're Muir's." He nodded. "Every time I see a pair of twins who look much alike, I worry." The sisters chuckled.
So do we,
they said in unison. He offered each of them an elbow. "Where to now?" One nodded.
We'll take you home and make a better plan.
Her sister hesitated.
We don't know much, mind you, only that we were to put the pair of you together. We have expected fireworks, but of course they weren't the right kind of fireworks.
"My fault entirely," he assured her. "I'll get it right the next time." She grimaced.
If there is a next time.
He laughed and set them moving on the pavement. "Dinna fret, ladies. When there are Muir witches about, miracles can happen." He flat out ignored the worried looks the sisters exchanged when they thought he wasn't looking. Muir's or not, he would find a way to see Assa again, and it would have to be soon, for he didn't have much time. If the lass truly was a neighbour to the Muirs, at least following the women home would get him closer to Assa, physically, than he was at the moment. His conscience worried at him as they made their way to the small red car the sisters claimed as their own, but he was determined not to give that conscience much attention until after his mortal time ended. "What good can you be to the last now," it hissed, "when you'll be gone so soon?" "Is it so wrong to want a day or two of happiness?" he argued. "Maybe," his conscience rejoined. "It very well may be." Assa put the kettle on and paced the kitchen while she waited. A cup of tea would be just the ticket for settling her thoughts and stilling her shaking hands. There was no use trying to rest otherwise. If she was honest with herself, however, she would have to admit she was a coward, afraid to lie down and close her eyes. She was afraid she might see the Highlander again as soon as she nodded off. And worse, she was just as afraid she wouldn't. The door opened and Jamie stomped in with an armful of wood. "Rain's a-comin'." He filled the wood box at the far end of the kitchen, the room that now occupied the whole of the original cottage. It was there Assa felt the most at home for some reason, and in spite of the large addition at the back of the house, built in the 1800s, she had the feeling she would rest much better at night if she simply climbed up into the loft above the stove and curled up beneath the baskets and drying herbs hanging from the rafters. "I thought you wanted to lie down," Jamie said, pausing at the door. Though it was the equivalent of asking her how she was feeling, she refrained from biting his head off. He'd seen how upset she'd been about the fight at the pub. It was natural for him to worry. However, she was determined not to tell the boys she'd been more upset over the stranger's sudden appearance than over the violence itself.
"I'll just have a cuppa first. Danny fash."
Jamie nodded and left. There were still a few good hours of work to do in the orchard, and they'd already agreed to treat her to Chinese food that evening so she wouldn't need to cook. Soon enough, the kettle whistled. The tea ritual calmed her as much as the tea itself, and she stretched out on the old couch under the window. She rolled forward, and something hard and painful bit her hip, and she jumped back to her feet. Deep in the pocket of her denims, she found a smooth, nearly transparent white rock. Something familiar. She reached out to place the rock on the mantel while she slept, but she couldn't seem to let it go. Her lucky rock, always with her. Always. Oh, it might not have prevented the accident that landed her in a coma, but who was to say it hadn't helped to bring her out of it? She switched it to the pocket on the other side and stretched out again. A few deep breaths did the rest, and she felt herself drifting off to Never Never Land.
"Come to me now, Mr. Ross. I dare you."
Gerard walked in a circle with his arms outstretched, surveying first the endless landscape of yellow fields, then the two women standing at the door of their wee ancient cottage that might crumble into a pile of dust at any moment. "You lied to me, the pair of ye." Lorraine, the slightly taller sister only because of an extra poofy bit of hair, laughed at him. Her sister took the accusation more to heart.
"We did not lie to you, Mr. Ross. We are neighbours with Assa and the boys. We simply never mentioned how much space there was between us, that's all."
Lorraine rolled her eyes.
"Get down off your high horse and come in, laddie. We'll draw you a map."
After one look at the map that included 2 glens and half a dozen path changes, he roared to his feet. "I'll waste all the time left of me with getting lost, and I certainly won't attempt to drive yon wee beastie ye call an auto."
"Fine then,"
said Loretta, and pushed the map into his hands in any case.
"Take the horse out back."
There certainly hadn't been a horse anywhere near the pile of rocks as they meandered along the hillside to reach it, but just then A muffled whinny came from just beyond the window, and the sisters exchanged smug smiles. "A horse indeed," he grunted, then tucked the map under one arm and ducked back out the only entrance. Around the back way, not only was there a fine chestnut steed, but a small paddock Gerard hadn't noticed either.
For emergencies!
Loretta called from the window.
Like this.
In a small shed against the teetering stone house, he found the saddle and tack he needed. After waving off an offer of supper, if the woman had food in the house, he'd be jiggered, he asked for a general direction and turned the horse to the west. And just in case he was chased away again by the boys and needed to return for some reason, he slowed his mount and turned back to get his bearings. The paddock was gone again. The wee house remained little better than a pile of rocks. The red car was still visible above the yellow flowers, but the paddock had disappeared. "I knew it." His horse stomped and complained. Gerard held completely still, prepared to fall to his feet the instant the horse dissolved beneath him. But a full minute later, the beast was still waiting for him to make up his mind. He reached out and gently patted the animal's neck. Smooth, firm, alive. He couldn't resist crossing himself and saying a little prayer for poor Sancerre. Even if the wee lass was a witch herself, the Muirs seemed a frightening bunch to call family. Demonstrating a great deal more faith than he possessed, he turned the horse back to the course he'd set. A quarter of an hour later, he was only halfway through his instructions when he came upon a large sign with peeling blue paint. The Mackay Hazelnut Company. Mackay. He finally had her last name. Poor record-keeping or not, the vicar wouldn't have found her name in the death records or her headstone in the kirkyard, because Assa Mackay was alive and well and living in the 21st century. And for the moment, so was Gerard. Chapter 8. Through the swirling clouds of wishes and elusive haze of dreams, Gerard Ross's voice found Assa. "I kept my promise, lass. I told ye if it were possible, I would come to Dingwall and find ye."
And so you have.
"And did ye keep your promise as well?" The teasing voice sounded just above her, and a warm, exciting chill shot through her body when a fleeting kiss landed on her collarbone, then was gone. She stretched like a lazy cat and smiled, happy his ghost had taken the challenge and come to her. If he were so easily summoned, she might be tempted to sleep forever again. "Your promise," he whispered. "Did you keep your promise?" She shook her head slightly.
What promise?
"To keep my forgiveness in your pocket, aye. The pebble, lass. Do you remember the pebble?" Another kiss, this time on her lips, was a reminder of his glorious taste. The memory had been lost to her forever. "Assa, my love," he murmured against her lips with his deep, rumbling baritone. "Dinna tempt me, aye. Sit up." She didn't want to sit up. It was her dream, not his. "Sit up, love." His voice came from farther away.
Don't go, Gerard.
"Ah, so you do remember my name then?" There was something about the teasing in his tone that brought her wide awake, and she slapped the pillow, frustrated she'd been unable to keep hold of the dream. "Here now, no violence to the cushion. There's a good lass." His voice, like his person, had crossed over into her waking world, and he was kneeling on the floor not 2 feet away from her. She bolted upright.
You?
"Aye, 'tis me, Assa, and no one is about, so no need for pretence. Besides," half of his face creased in a lopsided grin, "ye just called me by name." She tried to concentrate,
Gerard? Gerard Ross?
and she could still feel the tickle of his short, soft whiskers against her collarbone. Aye, lass, though Gerard is enough. He reached forward and placed his hand over hers where it rested on the edge of the couch. She pulled hers back.
I know your name, sir, and your face, but maybe you'll be good enough to tell me where we met.
Honest and true pain registered on his face for a full 3 seconds before he chased it away with a strained smile. You don't mean to tell me you remember nothing of our time together? She shrugged gently.
I'm sorry to say it, but
He shook his head. You remember my face and my name, but nothing of the road between the Clutie Well and Inverness. Nothing of Dunvegan House.
I'm sorry.
He nodded quickly. But you do recognise me.
I suppose so, but...
He scrambled closer and took her hand in both of his and forced it flat against his firm chest over his heart. Perhaps you've a notion of how we feel about each other then, or how we felt. He seemed suddenly confused, and there was something desperate in his eyes. The man's heart was breaking, and heaven help her, she was the one doing the breaking.
I'm sorry, Mr. Ross. I've recently been unwell, and I've forgotten a lot of things.
He ceased pressing on her hand, gently lifted it to his lips and kissed her palm, as if in benediction before handing it back to her. He leaned on the arm of the couch and got unsteadily to his feet. She wondered if he'd been drinking, but she could smell no hint of alcohol. It twisted her guts to think he might be reeling simply because she didn't remember him.
I am sorry.
He stopped her apology with a raised hand. No need, lass. In truth, perhaps I've mistaken ye for another lass from Dingwall, named Assa. He scrunched up his smile to force it to his watery eyes. It was so long ago, you see. There was really no hope that ye could be the same young woman. He backed toward the door. She stood, intending to see him out, but still a little reluctant to see him go.
You look a little older than myself. Do you ken this Assa woman when you were just a lad then?
He shrugged. Too long a tale for the little time I've left. I'll just be on my way, then.
Good luck to you, Gerard Ross.
He blinked, then closed his eyes, then blinked rapidly for a moment. That's right, I am Gerard Ross, a living, breathing Gerard Ross, and ye ken my name and my face. He came away from the door again, and she took a step back. And the sight of me made you drop a tray of dishes. You were that surprised to see me. That doesn't happen with mere strangers, lass, does it? She shrugged and retreated farther. You may have forgotten a good many things, but perhaps this will jog your memory. He reached behind her neck and pulled her closer. His eyes dipped to her lips. She pressed a hand against his chest to resist him, and he stopped pulling, though he left his hand where it was. Tell me, Assa, that you don't want to find out just as badly as I do. She swallowed, then breathed deeply of the taste of him. Not just the taste of his lips, but of him, the man standing before her. She stopped pushing on him and instead wrapped her hand in the sash of his kilt to keep him from retreating. Did she want to know? Yes, and badly. But more, she wanted to keep him close, this man who was more familiar to her than her own home. Whether they had met before as living, breathing people, or whether he truly had stepped out of her dreams, it didn't matter. All that signified was that she not let him go again. She lifted her chin.
Yes, I want to know.
As he closed the short distance between their mouths, she finally understood just how wet his eyes were, and when a tear splashed on her cheek and trickled down between their faces, she didn't know if it had come from his eyes or hers. The kitchen door burst open. "Who left the horse?" Jackie had obviously caught sight of them, but she didn't allow the Highlander to pull away. With her hand still clutching his sash, she gave him a pleading look.
"I don't know yet what goes on here between us, but please don't let them chase you away. Do not leave me."
His eyes crinkled with a happy smile, and he gave her a wink, then kissed the tip of her nose and turned to face her brother. "The horse is mine," he said. "Obviously," Ian growled. Hughie and Jamie had come inside as well. They all looked ready to do violence.
"I'll not have him hurt."
She tried to step around the Highlander to stand between him and the angry but well-intentioned mob spread out in front of the doorway, but the man extended his muscled arm and urged her behind him.
"Gerard,"
she said, and tried again.
"it's not as if I need protection from them, aye? You're the one in danger here."
He barked with laughter. "From these titmice!" Standing behind him as she was, she could look her fill, and she had to admit he was right to boast. Though Ian was a bit taller, he hadn't half the muscle of the Highlander, whose shirt strained across a well-sculpted back. The spread of his feet hinted at the size and strength of his thighs. His calves were carved from stone, and if he had the fighting experience to go along with it, as he'd proven at the pub, it was her kin who were in trouble here. Her stomach twisted with that sickening dread, however, and she was suddenly desperate to flee. Gerard quickly spun around to face her as if he'd sensed her distress. His brows pursed together with worry. "What is it, lass?" She shook her head briskly.
"No fighting. I'll not stand by and watch so much as a drop of blood spilled, do you hear me?"
"Not a drop," he said. "I swear it."
"Nor a bruise."
He nodded. "Nor a bruise." Jackie was suddenly at the man's shoulder. His worry was clear. "We'll not harm the man, Assa, I swear it, so long as he leaves and doesn't come back." "I'm staying." Gerard gave her another wink. "So long as she needs me." Then he frowned. "So long as I'm able." Chapter 9. The cousins weren't too pleased to have been overruled, and it delighted Gerard no end that the foursome had to play nice for the lass's sake. When it started raining, Jamie volunteered to move the horse into the shed. Ian and Hughie drove into town to pick up Chinese food and a bit of fresh air. Gerard only laughed because they couldn't be more specific with their insults without upsetting the lass. It was a fact he laughed a bit too much on occasion, and Assa needed only pucker her brows a bit, and he was put in his place as well. An explosion of thunder shook the house, and Assa flew onto his lap and cowered against his chest. "Oh, lass, nothing but a noise, no harm done, aye." But she still cowered. This was not the same brave woman who sat calmly in a parlour and wove fanciful tales for a couple of redcoats who would have seen her hanged at a moment's notice. Not the lass who thought she could hold him prisoner with only a blade held across her knees with which to threaten him. Not the woman who stood at the larder door and allowed him to go to battle, even though she believed he was going to his death. But what had happened to her? What had changed her so much? Was the current century so much more difficult than the 18th had been? Or had she seen too many unspeakable things done in the name of King George in the days after Culloden to banish her brave face forever? She was the spitting image of the Assa he'd known. Not a hair missing, not a new wrinkle to her brow. He couldn't imagine she would have spent much time in the past before being brought forward, but there was no one about who would know the answers to the questions he wished to ask. How was it her brother and cousins were brought along with her? Was it the workings of a Muir witch? Sonny herself? Or had that uncle of hers, Wickham, gone back and plucked her out of the past to be part of Gerard's own quest? He suppressed the urge to cross himself and say a prayer, for he would never wish away this chance to have her back in his arms again, no matter who had brought it about. Assa from Dingwall, how am I to save ye? Reunited with her in spite of logic, in spite of reason, what mighty deed had he already done in truth to deserve her? Or was he only being set up for a great punishment to pay for the lives he took at Culloden? Was Assa being dangled in front of his eyes only to be ripped away again on the morrow? Was he allowed this indulgence like an addiction so the next separation would be more painful? If so, he realized he didn't give a damn. He would profess his love and hold her tight every minute he was able. And if he paid for it in the very depths of hell's fire, he would burn with a smile upon his face. The cousins returned with supper, and no matter how they tried to arrange themselves around the table, Assa simply ordered her brother to move so that she and Gerard could sit together.
It's either that, Jackie, or I'll sit in his lap again. Which would you prefer?
Jackie rolled his eyes and moved over. Chinese food, as it happened, was a strange and slippery meal made with an unbearable amount of salt. But some morsels were tasty enough to make up for the rest. As a newly reincarnated man, Gerard didn't know how his body would handle actual sustenance, but he was happily surprised to find himself even stronger and more invigorated than before. It was a bit awkward to eat with just the left hand, but his right was occupied beneath the table, exploring every detail of Assa's left hand. The other men didn't seem to enjoy the meal at all. Their attention kept wandering to the same spot on the table, as if there were a window through which they were able to see his and Assa's fingers entwining over and over again. Finally, they picked up their plates and moved away, and by the manner in which Assa laughed, Gerard realized she'd been tormenting the lads on purpose, since she kept hold of him even after the others had left the table. However, he was content to be so sorely used. After a while, Gerard noticed Hughie glancing from him to the door and back again in a clear message. Gerard nodded like he understood perfectly, then got to his feet and stretched his arms away from him, as if he had just realized how tired he was. Hughie gave him an approving nod. Gerard held out a hand to Assa. "I believe I should go check on the horse, lass. Would you like to come along?" Assa grinned and took his hand. She completely missed the dark look Hughie had for him as she hurried out the door ahead of him. He hung back long enough to thank the cousin for the suggestion with a wink. He lifted the end of his plaid over both their heads, and they were only partially soaked by the time they hurried into the large shed that contained a small tractor and one sleepy horse that ignored them outright. Gerard was immediately sorry when he noticed how terribly the lass shivered. Look what I've done. You're chilled to the bone." He shook the rein from the plaid and applied it around her shoulders. The fact that he needed to stand close in order to do so played right into his plans. "Stand as close as you like. I vow not to bite ye." She chuckled and snuggled against his chest. The rain on the tips of her red curls sprayed onto him when she moved her head, and he considered it more helpful than anything. His thoughts needed a bit of cooling. After all, his memories of them together seemed to cluster around the time they spent in Dunvegan House, and what might have happened eventually if he'd never left her.
What is it?
She watched his face closely. He smiled and shook his head. "Nothing, just remembering."
Brilliant. Tell me everything. I'm weary from trying to remember you when all that I truly need is for you to explain. Where is it we met? You said something about Clooty Well and a place called Dunvegan House.
He nodded and tried to decide what he could say that wouldn't have her calling the police to have him carted away. If she had no recollection of Culloden, or her life before Culloden, she'd hardly believe him if he started there. There was also the worry about Sonny's intentions. The lass had no memory for a reason, he assumed, so perhaps he wasn't supposed to tell her much at all. Had he been given the chance to see her again, with a clean slate, so to speak, so that he could win her heart without the distraction of the Jacobite uprising throwing them together, forging them by fire? Was he to prove he was worthy of her in the quiet of everyday life? But to what end? If he only had a day or two, why toy with her heart at all? He couldn't help himself, however. Woo her he would, and if Sonny had other plans for him, she should have been more clear. He picked up her hand and kissed her knuckles, and was pleased when she shivered, believing it had little to do with the temperature. We did meet near Clutie Well. Ye were there alone, and the 3 men were teasing ye, and before I could come to your aid, ye scared them off on your own, daring them to harm ye. I admit I was a bit intimidated myself.
Clutie Well? I wonder what I was doing there.
You left a pretty button, if I remember right. Perhaps ye had sick family, aye, and ye asked the fairies to heal them. She rolled her eyes.
Maybe. But why were you there?
He shrugged. I canna remember. I'd gone often enough it was a habit to stop and pay my respects. She nodded, satisfied. He wanted to stay away from politics completely, just in case it triggered a landslide of memories she wouldn't be able to handle all at a go, though Scottish independence was just as timely a subject in present day as it had been in the 18th century. Only this time, folks didn't have to discuss it in secret anymore, though some pubs banned such discussions to avoid brawls under their roofs.
So, we met at Clutie Well. What else?
He shrugged. Then we walked to Inverness. She gasped.
Walked?
Gerard panicked, not knowing where to steer the conversation next, so he pulled her close and looked at her lips. What do the details matter, Massa? You'll not remember them anyway. Isn't it enough to remember that you loved me once, and you might again if you give it a wee try? She looked at his lips too, but he suspected she was trying to remember them, not trying to get closer to them. We kissed once on the Kissock Ferry. Do you remember that? Her head wobbled slowly back and forth, her eyes still where he wanted them. It went something like this. He lowered his mouth to hers and tried to remember just how they'd kissed while they jostled between the other passengers. Oddly enough, he'd nearly forgotten anyone else had been on that boat. She took a deep breath and sighed, then pulled back and lifted the plaid from her shoulders.
This is getting us nowhere.
He laughed. Speak for yourself.
I'll warm now,
she explained, and pushed the wool into his hands. So am I. He laughed again. She smiled, but behind it he saw the sadness lingering in her eyes. Poor lassie, dinna fash. I'm certain your memory will return in a matter of days. He swallowed the urge to tell her he would be long gone when she did. Your mind will heal from its wounds, and the doors will open again. Until then, you must trust me.
Trust you?
Aye. Believe me when I tell you that you love me more than life itself. She laughed and began walking toward the door.
More than life itself?
Aye. He caught up to her, wrapped his hands around her waist and swung her around to keep her to himself just a little longer. And if you can't quite believe that, then at least believe that I've loved you more than Romeo ever loved Juliet. Assa rolled her eyes.
Romeo and Juliet only knew each other for a pair of days before they were ready to die for each other. Not realistic at all.
He bit his lip and looked away.
Gerard, just how long were we together?
He smiled. I've loved ye forever, lass. She frowned, unhappy with his prevarication.
And how long did I love you?
I dinna ken how long ye pined for me after I was gone, aye.
But how long before you were gone,
He felt like a child, caught in a lie, but he wanted no lies between them. One day, he said, one day we had together before we parted, and I've loved you every day since then. Her eyes sparkled with moisture before he had finished speaking, and he couldn't allow it. He couldn't let her doubt. If only she could remember, she could know just how passionately they'd felt at the end. He took her hands and pulled her close. Now, you listen to me, Assa. I don't give a fig what you believe about how long it takes to fall deeply and completely in love with a person. It doesn't matter a whit. I'll admit I was slow at it. Possibly 2 whole minutes passed between the moment our eyes met and moment my heart jumped from my chest into your hands, aye. But it only matters that it did. And it only matters that when you were standing at the larder door, giving me one last look at ye before I left, you'd given me your heart as well, to take with me, and to this day I've never given it back, aye. It's mine, and I'm keeping it. He dropped her hands and pulled her roughly against him, trying to show her how fervently he did love her, hoping the taste of his kiss would be enough to make her believe it all. After a long minute, he pulled back and looked into her eyes, hoping for a flicker of recognition. But she was looking away toward the door. Someone was shouting. Chapter 10. Gerard held tight to Assa's hand as they hurried out into the yard and back to the house where someone was pushing his way through the door. They followed him inside. The older fellow pushed his slicker off his head and shouted above the sound of the storm. The dike's failed. We've got a flood headed this way, and if it gets deep enough, the nets will be ruined. Ian slammed a hat on his head and reached for his coat. We've got to move them to higher ground. Someone needs to hurry up the bin and slow the water. It's probably too late, but it may keep us from losing them all. Gerard gave Assa's hand a squeeze and released her. I'll take the horse. It'll be fastest. Ian gave him a sharp look, then nodded. Take Jamie with you. He won't weigh the horse down. Gerard paused at the door long enough to throw the lass a wink. I'll be back. She put on a brave smile and nodded. As he waited for Jamie to mount behind him, he realised he might be about to perform the deed he'd been sent for, and he worried he might be taken away as soon as he finished. But he'd promised Assa he'd return, not unlike the promise he'd made nearly 270 years before. Please, God, let me keep my promise. The horse Gerard had borrowed from the Muirs was a powerful beast. With 2 full-grown men on its back, it climbed as if it felt no weight at all. The trail was steep enough at one point they had to get off and climb separately. An ATV wouldn't have been much help. Sometimes old ways were the best ways. The path levelled out again, and Gerard mounted. Then he reached down to help the drenched cousin. His hand moved through the lad's arm without catching, as if he were reverting back to spirit form. Jamie didn't seem to notice. He simply grabbed the back of the saddle and heaved himself up with little effort. And with their pressing errand ahead, Gerard decided it best to worry after the task was finished. After all, he only needed to be substantial enough to fix a dike. But it hurt his heart to think he might never again feel the press of Assa's lips. They reached a large plateau where a small lake of water lay waiting to pour itself down the mountainside. A well-built dam held it back for the most part. Thick, foot-square railroad ties made an immovable wall, shored up by concrete pillars. But at the near edge, 2 boards had come loose and dangled in a heavy rush of water, releasing 10 times as much as the rest of the dam allowed. "If we hurry, we can catch them before they wash away," Gerard pointed, and Jamie agreed. They dismounted, and Gerard's attention caught on a coil of rope he hadn't noticed before, as if God himself had reached down and handed him the tools with which he could accomplish his task. But again, he had no time to question the gift, or the source of that gift. He opened the small leather ties and freed the rope, then made his way to the edge of the dike. Jamie held out a hand to take it from him. "I'll climb across the top and drop the rope down to catch the timber." Gerard shook his head. "I'll do it. I'll not impress Assa if I lose her cousin, aye. You stand at the side and try to catch it if I fail." Jamie reluctantly nodded and changed positions with him. Climbing across the top wasn't as dangerous as he'd expected, however. The rest of the dike held firm in spite of the force of the water washing through the gap. The rope God blessed him with was sadly a bit short, so he had to tie a lasso and squat down to toss it over the edge of the dangling log. He tossed the lasso, but it closed to a small ring before hitting the end of the wood. He made the opening wider and tried again, but the weight of the water pushed it closed again. He pulled a length of leather from his sporran, the one he sometimes used to tie back his hair, and tied the lasso open with a loose knot that would come free with a little more than a firm pull. Then he lowered the rope again. The water pushed it to the right and wouldn't allow it back over the end. He climbed down again, and he and Jamie hurled large rocks at the opening, trying to change the angle of the spray. When they finally succeeded, Gerard climbed back onto the dike and lowered the rope again. This time it slid over the left side, but caught on a rough edge. When he tried to pull it loose, the piece of leather fell away and the lasso closed again. But the rope was now well and truly caught on the wood, and he couldn't retrieve it. "We've no time to think of anything else," Jamie shouted. "Just hold tight to it. I'll slip it over." "Careful, laddie. You're worth more than the entire farm, aye." Jamie grinned, grasped onto a thick root growing out of the ground beside the dike, and climbed onto the concrete pillar. "I can reach it easily from here, aye." He pushed at the rope until it came free. Then he manoeuvred it back and forth until it slipped over the square end. But as he did so, the log shifted. His hand was caught in the rope, and his eyes flew wide and met Gerard's. If Gerard let go of the rope, the loosened log would fall and take the lad with it. If he pulled tight and brought the plank back into the gap, Jamie would be anchored to the log and drown in the flow before Gerard might reach him and cut him free. God help me. His only choice was to pull both the lad and the log up out of the water, but did he have the strength to do it? "I've got you, Jamie. Hold fast." He only hoped that when all was said and done, the lad would still have a hand. He squatted low, pulled the end of the rope across his upper back and straightened. He fought the drag of the water and lifted with all his considerable strength. He squatted quickly again and shifted the slack from his right to his left side and pulled again. Other than the weight of the wood and the pounding rhythm of the water, the load rose more easily the second time, but he knew it could only be caused by a lighter load. Jamie was gone. Barely able to breathe, he hefted the log the remainder of the way. He swung it easily around him and dropped it back into the water where the flow pressed it into its original place. The gush was instantly cut in half. "Aye, if you could see your face, man, you'd think someone had died." Jamie grinned at him from the side of the dike where he held fast to the thick root, his chest heaving with effort. "When you give it some slack, my hand slipped right out. Lucky I was to catch the side." Then he laughed. "But don't worry, I won't tell Assa how close she came to killing me." Chapter 11. Assa tried to appear calm and controlled when Hughie came outside the storehouse to knock on her window. "We've got them up out of the water. 10 are soaked, but we've hung them from the walls. We'll build a battle fire in the centre and dry them out. May just save them all."
Brilliant.
"Are you cold? You look cold."
I've got the heater on. I'm balmy. I can wait until you're finished.
Hughie nodded. "I'll stay with the fire, but Jackie and Ian can take you back to the house by 1:15. Will that do?"
No hurry.
He looked up at the sky. "Still buckets out here, but the water level has fallen. Looks like Jamie and your headbanger have found success."
Brilliant.
She said again, ignoring the insult to the man who might either save her from insanity or take her along with him. Hughie disappeared through the door, and a loud clap of thunder had her all but cowering on the floor.
Just a noise. Nothing but a noise. No harm done.
Gerard's words supplied her with a bit of comfort, even though she was alone. She could almost feel his arms around her, feel his chest against her hand. Of course, Jackie and the boys hadn't been much of a physical comfort to her since the accident, but they'd never been much for offering a shoulder to cry on. They'd always just been in the background, watching over her, letting her know she was protected at all times. But sometimes a woman needed the comfort of a man who didn't share so much genetic material with her. She smiled in spite of the frightening rattle of rain on the rooftop, remembering just how different Gerard Ross was. She only wished that warm form was sitting in the lorry with her, with a warm arm around her shoulders and his warm mouth pressed against her lips. A snippet of a memory came to her then of sitting on the man's lap in a fancy chair blocking a door. She was telling him he would have to stay put. He was trying not to laugh in spite of the dagger she held in her hands. Thunder clapped again and again, so loud it was like cannon fire. She could almost smell the sulphur. The sound of gunfire popped in her ears, and she scrunched down in the seat, hands over her ears. What terrified her was realizing the sound was coming from within her, not from the storm outside. Screaming, begging voices bubbled up from where she suppressed them long ago. She closed her eyes, but they only grew louder. Clouds filled her mind, parted, thickened again. Someone bellowed in defiance. It was Gerard. She would recognize his voice anywhere. He stood knee-deep in mud, fighting more than one man, roaring with every effort as he took the redcoats down, all of them. But when he sank to the ground himself, she knew he would not be getting up again. Redcoats? Battle? What madness had her poor mind conjured? She wanted to go back to the last dream, the one where she'd been sitting on his lap. He'd been explaining why he had to go and fight, even if it meant he had to die.
No!
Her voice echoed back at her immediately. She was still alone in the cab of the truck, and going well and truly mad. Gerard's heart was worn out from all the breaking and mending it had done that day, but he rallied enough effort to help Jamie move the second nog into place. The flow was slowed well enough they were able to leave it to better equipped men to repair. Then they sat and caught their breath for a moment before starting down the hill again. Jamie gave him a curious frown. "What is it you want with my cousin? That is, besides the obvious." "Oh, lover, it's as simple as that. From another place and time, perhaps, but I love her just the same as if we were still in that place and time." "And ye mean to marry her?" Gerard huffed out a frustrated breath. "At most, I have only a day more, you see. All I can give her are the hours I have left." Jamie chuckled. "What are you saying? That you're going to die or something?" Gerard looked him in the eye and willed the lad to trust him. "Something like that, aye." Jamie rolled his eyes. "You're a loon, is what I think. and I believe my kin and I were put on this earth to protect her from someone like ye." Gerard got to his feet and shook the rain from what remained of his pleats. "And I am certain I've been put on this earth to prove my love for Assa McKay before it's too late." He widened his stance a bit, just in case. "Do ye mean to stop me?" Jamie made a face and shook his head. "Oh nay, I promised her I wouldn't harm ye, even though I could, mind." Gerard laughed and headed for the horse. But of course you could, of course you could." Jamie followed slowly. "But I see no need for violence, Ross. I'm sure you'll go on your way once you realise you've got the wrong lass." "Oh?" The man grinned. "Aye, I'm sure of it, because my cousin is no McKay. She's a Kennedy, just like the rest of us." "A Kennedy?" Jamie's answer was a wide, toothy grin. "A Kennedy." Chapter 12. Gerard mounted the horse for the simple fact he didn't trust his feet to find the way blindly. His mind reeled. His eyes saw nothing but flashes of memories parading before them, and what his heart tried to tell him, his stomach rebelled against. She could not be his Kennedy. She was Assa from Dingwall, a separate woman entirely. Kennedy was a common enough name in the Highlands. Was it such a coincidence that the two women he'd cared for in his nearly 300 years of existence bore the same surname? Certainly. Certainly. His heart pounded so powerfully he was surprised the animal beneath him didn't spook. He was spooked. Only 2 weeks ago he'd told Nessa to let her hair down and she'd refused. She'd resisted giving him her name as well. Had she only relented after she'd decided to give him a false one? Nessa the ruthless, instead of Assa the mild. Was she laughing at him? No, they could not be one and the same woman. He would have known. If Nessa had been Assa, he would have felt some charge of electricity when they'd touched on Culloden. But they'd never touched. No wonder he was angry with Wickham for laying his hands on Nessa's arms before taking her away from him. No! He shook his head vigorously to force the idea out of his mind, but the motion made the horse stumble, so he stopped. Instead, he tried another tack, hoping to prove to himself they had to be two different women. Assa's eyes were golden brown, Nessa's were... He couldn't remember. The firelight had caressed her face, but her eyes had been in shadow. But her face... He tried to imagine Assa's face if her hair were pulled up beneath a large cap, but his imagination failed him. Height? The same. Weight? It was impossible to guess with Nessa's loose clothing. Their voices. His ears remembered nothing. Please, God, give me something. His mind went back to that bedchamber at Dunvegan House. They'd argued. She'd begged him not to leave her. He remembered the dressing gown she'd worn, the blade she produced from the folds, and laid across her knees, as if that would be enough to stop him. She'd been so sure he would die at Culloden, but how had she known? How could anyone have known when the battlefield had yet to be chosen? Unless she'd already seen the battle. After so many years, he'd forgotten her prophecy, that the Highlanders would be routed from their homes and slaughtered or be starved out. He remembered faltering on the moor, no longer able to lift a blade, and his last thoughts had been for the lass who had predicted it all, just as the battle had unfolded, and he would not rest until he knew how she'd known. Look, it was true then. He stopped fighting it, though his stomach still ached, and he found it impossible to exhale without pain. His mind stopped struggling. Assa the mild had become Nessa the ruthless. She'd fought upon the moor, fallen and risen to haunt it for centuries. No, to haunt him for centuries. But why? Had she truly been so angry with Charles Stewart that she refused to find peace? Or had she refused to find peace in favour of mocking him, watching him mourn the loss of her for decades, holding a secret that could make him happy? She couldn't have loved him as she'd claimed to, and hide from him when they might have been happy all those years. 27 decades they might have had together. There, at the bottom of the hill, was she laughing at him still? Was she only pretending not to remember so she could add another 2 days of insult to the 100,000 days she'd already had? His chest constricted around his heart like a fist of sharpened blades. But it wasn't the everlasting years on the moor that brought the pain. It was the lies she'd told him at Dunvegan House, for those declarations of her love had been his spirit's only sustenance. It had given him peace to know that somewhere someone had loved him, and now that peace was gone. Ian climbed into the driver's seat. Jackie hopped into the back of the truck and sat upon the side, and they were off. Assa's cousin didn't complain about the heat, though she'd lost track of just how hot it had become, while her mind wandered in and out of strange memories. Her big cousin noted her face when they pulled back onto the road that led to the house. Something amiss? She shook her head.
I've been remembering.
Nothing good, I assume.
No, not really. I can't tell if I've dreamed these things or if I've lived them.
Have you remembered anything about him? He didn't need to use a name. They both knew who he was talking about.
Yes, that's the problem.
Ian's alarm deepened the furrows on his brow. His long hair and the fall of darkness couldn't hide it. He's part of the bad memories. She shrugged.
I thought he was just part of the bad dreams, but now he shows up in the flesh, and I realise those can't just be dreams.
Well, once he's gone, Ian grumbled, maybe they can go back to just being dreams.
But what if I don't want him to go?
Her cousin gave her a sharp look, watched her for a moment, then nodded. Then I'd take it he's part of some better dreams as well. She took a deep breath, tried the truth on for size, then nodded. Ian forced a smile, though his brow had yet to clear. We'll see what he's made of then, shall we? If he treats you well, we'll have no quarrel with him. And when he gets round to explaining how the two of ye ken each other, we'll see how ye feel then. They got to the house just as the horse appeared from the side yard. Jamie slid off the back and ran up to her window with a grin on his face. Were we in time? Ian nodded. Aye, a few wet nets are hanging up to dry. The rest were moved in time. Hughie's tenting a barrel fire. Jamie's eyes lit up. A fire? How bad is the dyke? 2 large logs were topsy-turvy, but Ross pulled a miracle out of his sporran, you might say, and saved the day. It will need serious repair tomorrow. Ian nodded. Go on with you then. Hughie will welcome the company. Jamie leaned close and nodded toward Gerard, who was still on the horse. Though the reins had stopped, he still looked like a drowned rat in the headlamps. Careful now, he's in the mood. He opened Assa's door for her and took off in the direction of the storehouse. Ian climbed out and approached the horse and rider. I owe ye a debt, Ross. The other man shook his head. Jamie probably won't tell ye, but I nearly killed him up there. On purpose? Accident. Ian shrugged. Then no harm. I'll have to go. He finally looked her way, and though she'd been moving closer, his stare stopped her in her tracks. He was obviously angry with her specifically, though she couldn't imagine why.
What is it?
Jamie was safe. She couldn't imagine any bad news he might have for her, but she felt as if a sharp blade hung over her head, poised to fall. I can't believe all that time. He stared at her face, as if seeing her for the first time. Then he grimaced. How could I not have seen it sooner? He was making about as much sense as her memories at the moment, so she hurried to his side, to touch his leg, to offer comfort.
You are real, are you not, Gerard Ross?
He looked down at her with such a fierce combination of hurt and hate, she was tempted to back away. But she couldn't. If he was hurting, she wanted to fix it. Aye, he hissed. For a wee while yet, I am real, no matter how much I regret it. She shook her head.
Gerard, please, tell me, what has happened?
His face softened for a moment, and he glanced away. If you don't remember, you'll not understand, so there's no sense in explaining. I mistook you for someone else is all. Fairly well, Nessa Kennedy. He spurred the horse and led it around her. Then he was gone. Something in her chest shifted and crushed the air out of her lungs. Something true and familiar. Something too horrible to bear. Nessa. Violence itself, hateful revenge, mindless rage, all those were inferred by the Irish name. The very opposite of Assa, and yet so familiar. How could it feel so familiar?
Ian!
She reached out to him, but her cousin was already backing away. I'll get Jamie. We'll find out what happened up there. Jackie caught her around the shoulders and led her into the house. But once inside, she pushed him away. Alone, so alone, she stumbled to the couch and collapsed upon it in a whimpering, weeping mess. She was collapsing upon herself like a crumbling old house with no hope left to prop her up. Sure, there would be nothing left of her by the time her cousins returned. Her mind and her heart were turning inside out. How could the rest of her survive it? Chapter 13. When he was well away from the farm, Gerard gave the horse his head. If it happened to return him to the Muir sisters, fine and well. If it carried him off a cliff, he cared not at all. As long as he was away from Kennedy, duplicitous, cruel Kennedy, he was content. Tears splashed down his face like rain, and he laughed at himself. What a fool! How could he have never seen the resemblance before? He'd been within half a bloody mile of her for 269 years, and he'd never taken a good look. He'd never noticed the curve of her cheek, the tilt of her eyes, nothing. And now, in the harshest turn of all, he was robbed of any satisfaction. How could he call her out for something she couldn't remember, if in fact she couldn't remember? And if that bastard Wickham had taken her memories away when he'd removed her from the moor, Gerard would have to wait outside the gates of hell if he wanted to read the sin in her eyes, to make her confess to what she'd done, to make her explain. God help him, what an idiot he must have seemed. Had the choice been hers to remain on the moor, like some troublesome Puck watching from the trees for her own amusement, watching him pine away for her without a thought to end his suffering? No, that wasn't true. She couldn't have known his thoughts, couldn't have known how obsessed he'd been those first few decades, but she could have guessed. After all the play-acting at Dunvegan House, she must have followed him along to the battlefield, only to get caught up in her own prophecy. Perhaps anger over that twist of fate had kept her there. If he could, he'd damn her back to Culloden, to wander another 3 centuries for her betrayal. Only this time, she'd have no Gerard Ross to amuse her. Come for me, Sansouris, I beg ye. When the boys returned, Assa managed to pull herself together for the sake of her brother and cousins. Jamie was careful to explain the details of what went on between himself and Gerard Ross up at the dyke. There was nothing more helpful than the fact that Ross had believed her to be Assa McKay and was surprised to learn she was actually a Kennedy. There was no history of a feud between the families, so there was no telling what might have upset the Highlander or why he had then called her Nessa. If the pair of them were destined to suffer insanity, she wished they could have suffered together. In any case, she'd calmed down enough to assure the lads she was finished weeping for the night. In truth, she was more fatigued than she'd ever felt in her life, what little of that life she could remember. Though she suspected her soul was bleeding, there was nothing she could do to stem it. All the wailing and all the tears her body had produced had done nothing to improve matters. Her only hope was that a few hours' sleep would give her strength to face another day. A Gerardless day. Jackie swore he would find the man in the morning and get the truth out of him, without the use of force, or so he claimed. She pretended to believe him, but the look Gerard had given her, as if she'd betrayed him to his worst enemy, gave her little hope the man would answer to her brother. In her bones, she believed she would never see the Highlander again. He'd walked out of her dreams, and into her life, and out of her life once more, all in a day, and all without her understanding why. It was as if the universe was testing her, only she didn't understand the test. Gerard stopped the horse for a moment before they crossed a wide road, and as he watched, a car crested the small rise to the right, so he waited. But the car didn't pass. It slowed, pulling off the carriageway, and stopped only 20 feet from him. To his pleasant surprise, it was just the person he wanted to see, but he only realized how dearly he'd wished for that meeting when he recognized the face of Wickham, Sonny's uncle. The man switched off his headlamps and got out of the car. After a firm slam of the door, he nodded. "Ross, Wickham, I came straight away. It seems you've botched things, and I'll hear no end of it from the women folk." Wickham stripped off a pair of driving gloves as he spoke. "So I've come to thank ye." Gerard chuckled and slid off the horse. "I've a few things for which I'd like to thank ye as well, which—" Wickham laughed. "I'm afraid I'm going to enjoy this much more than I should." "Dinna hold back on my account, old man." He had to be at least 26 to Gerard's 24. Wickham's grin widened. "I don't intend to." They circled for a bit, taking each other's measure. Gerard finally stepped forward, ducked, then punched Wickham in the gut. It was a very firm gut at that, but it still forced a bit of breath from the man's lips. "That's for laying hands on Kennedy," he said, then stepped away again. Wickham seemed in no hurry, and when they came together again, he gave a jab to Gerard's left ribs was all. Gerard failed to connect with the man's jaw, and when he inhaled again, he realized the witch's blow had done more damage than he'd thought, so he stepped away to recover and fill his lungs again. The next time they engaged, Gerard finally got another taste of satisfaction when his left hand caught Wickham square in the chest. That was for stealing her memories. He ignored the fact that the punch had cost him a busted lip. The next time Wickham came at him so slowly, he was sure he could defend himself. But before he could get his arms up, he'd been struck in the temple on his left and whacked across his jaw on the right. His head tried to go in both directions at the same time. "That was for leaving the lass after ye promised to stay," Wickham snarled. "Wait a bloody minute," Gerard barked, once he'd gotten his lips back together again. "Fight fair, damn ye, none of your time tricks." Wickham laughed and dropped his hands, then narrowed his eyes. "I have no time tricks, Highlander. I am time." And while Gerard watched and waited, his hands raised to defend himself against whatever the man might throw at him, he felt an explosion of pain against his face, All the while, Wickham stood 5 feet from him. Not so much as a finger had twitched, and yet Ross felt himself falling to the ground, sure he would never rise again, just as he had on Culloden so long ago. Somewhere overhead, a low buzzing noise transformed into Wickham's voice. "Dinna feel too bad, laddie. At least one of Culloden's ghosties was bound to feel his quest. I just didn't expect it to be the one with the simplest task." "Oh," the man tisked. "That barrier I placed around Assa's memory, thin as a butterfly's wing. You might have blown it away with a whistle, you bombpot, but it's too late now." He tisked again. "I'll send Sansaray for ye in the morning. If I were ye, I'd think upon my sins." In the wee hours before dawn, Gerard awoke to the snort of an impatient horse whose lead had been looped around his boot. By some miracle, he'd managed to untangle the beast and climb upon its back without his head splitting open and his brains falling out. The horse did indeed return him to the Muir sisters. Despite the hour and the darkness, the women seemed to be awake. Light seeped out of the cracks in the stone walls and, combined with millions of yellow blossoms, created a warm halo around the house in the middle of the field. Gerard took the horse into the paddock and brushed him down as well as he was able before approaching the door. For the life of him, he didn't know how he was going to explain his change of heart since the sisters had seen him last, anxious to be reunited with his Assa. Assa was dead to him. Nessa had killed her. Simplest terms were all he could handle at the moment. He knocked on the door twice and it opened. "Good morning, ladies." The twins faced each other across a round table, playing cards and smoking short cigars, if he wasn't mistaken. The low-ceilinged room was lit with cheerful lamps. Ruffles and doilies were spread about the place, with no trace of the dust from the previous day. The women themselves had little attention to spare him, and when they did glance up, they appeared none too happy to see him, and not concerned in the slightest that his head was now misshapen. At least it felt misshapen.
"Thank you for seeing to the horse,"
said the sister with her back to him. "Not at all," he replied. "Sonny will be coming for me."
"Not until morning,"
said the other sister.
"It's been a long day. You'll find a bed in the small room there."
With her stub off a cigar, she pointed to a slatted door and went back to her cards. Unwilling to argue about the time, he ducked into the little room, grateful for a private space where he would be expected to converse with no one at all. The cot was short, but he didn't mind, and with hope that morning would come swiftly, he slipped into a deep mortal sleep. The darkness swirled and parted. He was suddenly back at Dunvegan House, scooping Assa into his arms and sprinting up the stairs with her hanging on to his neck. He remembered every touch, every moment she sat on his lap and tried to convince him he was at her mercy. Of course he was at her mercy. He relived the tender kisses that had carried him through thousands of sorry nights on the moor, relieved the moment when he'd left her standing at the larder door. Those tears had been real. Her heartbreak, too. She hadn't been pretending. Then why, oh why, hadn't she sought him out in spirit form? They might never have been able to relive those kisses or the one on the ferry, but at least they would have been together. Even in silence, unable to touch, it would have been bliss itself just to have her near. He'd needed her. He needed her still. Chapter 14. Assa rose in the darkness, and for the span of a heartbeat she thought she was outside, lying on the moor where she'd fallen during the battle. But what battle? The remnants of a dream. It made no sense otherwise, but it seemed like familiar ground. A small tuft of heather among the turf and mosses. It had been her own spot. The rest of them gave her a wide berth, but the rest of whom? She closed her eyes for a moment and saw another spot off to the right, where the mud had been deep and cold, and the surface changed regularly. That was his spot. His, Gerard's. And beyond, a row of red flags. Culloden. She must have made some distressing sound, because Jackie appeared at her bedroom door, still groping for the tie of his robe. Assa, what is it? What's amiss?
I need to go to Culloden Moor.
Now?
Now.
He nodded once. I'll take you. Give me a moment, aye. Culloden. The word sat comfortably on her tongue, and in the strange haze from her dream, she had the oddest, comforting sensation that she was about to go home. But was it a beloved place because it was so familiar? Or was it because Gerard Ross had been there too? No, it only mattered that she was going, and she was sure when she got there, her memory would be waiting for her like a forgotten parcel. Gerard slipped his boots on quietly and reached for the small door that separated the end of the cottage from the rest. It opened silently on leather hinges, but it hadn't mattered. The Muir sisters turned to stare at him as if he'd shouted good morrow. The two wore matching expressions of displeasure, along with a pair of blue house robes and slippers. Their hair was wrapped around fat curlers atop their heads, and a thin layer of something green on their faces. The one he thought was the rain folded her arms and pursed her lips.
We don't usually suffer fools, but we've promised to feed you breakfast before you go.
She pointed to a chair and turned her back, then produced a couple of heavy pans and slammed them on a stovetop in the corner that he was sure hadn't been there the night before. I beg you, stop. I need no breakfast. What I need, the rain pointed to the chair again, is for one of ye to take me back to the Kennedys. It didn't matter that the Chinese food hadn't lasted long in his belly, or that he could already smell the teasing taste of back bacon in the air. I have to get to Assa before Sonny collects me.
What's this?
Loretta turned away from the stove.
You've broken the girl's heart, just like she feared you would, and now you want to go back. If you've got plans to vent your spleen, boy, she doesn't need to hear it.
He shook his head dramatically. I beg your pardon. How do you know what Assa Kennedy fears when even she doesn't ken it? She waved an impatient hand.
We have friends who are Rosses. We've been watching out for you, you might say.
He forced the words out in case any of it was true. Thank you. Lorraine rolled her eyes at him.
Sonny told us Nessa was afraid you'd reject her, that all your kindness had been an act.
An act?
And if you thought you were stuck for an eternity on the moor.
Loretta chimed in.
With a man who didn't love you, who thought you were probably a spy. You wouldn't want to give him a chance to break your heart.
Lorraine finished. Gerard grunted. Hadn't he been harbouring the same hurt, thinking Assa hadn't truly cared for him either? I beg ye, take me to her. I must have her forgiveness before Sonny finds me. He gnawed on his lips for a moment or two. I didn't suppose you could give the lass a phone call and ask her to hold off. Loretta shook her head.
Phone died after I asked her to hurry.
Then we must hurry. She took the pan from the stove and set it into the sink instead of whacking him on the head with it, as he expected.
Get the keys, Lorraine.
She hadn't been pretending. The words repeated in Gerard's head a dozen times, and all the while the fresh rent in his heart began to close. He was glad no one could see his face while he sat in the rear seat of the wee red auto, since he was grinning like an idiot. Lorraine, in the passenger seat, mumbled something. "What's that?" He leaned closer to hear her better.
I just said it's a pity you came to your senses too late.
He leaned farther over the back of the seat and pointed to the cut on his brow. "Well, it took a wee bit more violence to clarify my memories, aye, and lucky I am you've this fine car to take me back to Assa." Lorraine gave a delicate snort.
Oh, it's a fine car now.
He nodded and grinned. "A real beauty, like the pair of ye." She patted her sister's arm.
Best drive quickly, Loretta, so the manure doesn't have time to pile up.
They turned onto the main road in no time and, thankfully, with no sign of Saint-Cyr. In less than 5 minutes, they came upon the hazelnut sign, and his heart nearly leapt from his chest at the sight of it. "Not long now," he told the poor, abused organ. The drive up to the house seemed interminable, and when they arrived, the cousins' lorry was parked outside, with the 3 cousins lined up alongside it. Their arms were folded, and a familial scowl darkened all their foreheads. Gerard jumped out and headed for the door, prepared to knock each man on his arse who tried to stop him, but they tried nothing of the sort. They merely stood and glared while he pounded on the door. The Muirs sat anxiously in the car, no doubt unwilling to show the others they were still in their robes and slippers. They glanced between himself and the cousins as if they were intently watching a tennis match. No one answered the door, so Gerard pounded again. "Assa!" "She's not here, Bampot," said the big blonde. "She's gone." "Gone where?" He had to find her before Sonny found him. "Forget her," the man said. "Ye had your chance and ye left her." "What?" said Hughie. "You think she had all the time in the world, did ye?" The man clamped his lips shut after a sharp look from Ian. Gerard's heart fell. He'd never stopped to think how much time she'd been given. If she'd been around for 2 weeks in human form, he supposed Sonny's rules no longer applied to her, and he still didn't know how her family had been preserved along with her. "Tell me what you mean." Hughie shook his head and looked away. "Jackie took her to Culloden," Jamie said quickly, ignoring his brother's gasps. "She woke with a strong need to see the place, so he took her." "Culloden!" If the sisters drove him back to the battlefield, they were bound to run into Sonny along the way, but he would simply have to pray that the wee witch would listen to reason and take pity on the fool. He banged on the roof of the car and opened the door. "Culloden, ladies." Then he climbed in the back and prayed he could reach Assa before he was sent on to hell. For surely, if he wasn't able to look into her eyes just one more time and beg her forgiveness, hell awaited him, no matter how much worth God placed on his soul. Chapter 15. As luck would have it, Loretta Muir was no doddering driver. Unfortunately, she proved incapable of driving slowly at all, as if bobbies were on her tail, and her with a dead body in the trunk of her car. Her sister only made things worse. Lorraine produced a comb and hairspray and arranged the hair on both their heads while her sister struggled to drive between the lines. Gerard closed his eyes and tried to ignore the dangers coming at him from both sides of the road, but his stomach rebelled and he was forced to witness it all. A man on a bicycle drove off into a field in fear of his life. A jogger and her dog pressed themselves up against a low rock wall when the noise of the vehicle turned their way. And the manner in which Loretta giggled afterward convinced him she'd done it on purpose, not because her sister yanked on a clump of her hair. By the time Inverness was in the rear window and they were headed north to the battlefield, the car was filled with an abominable cloud of hairspray that made Gerard wish he was a ghost again, so he didn't need to breathe the stuff. Out of desperation, he discovered how to open the window and pulled a clean, cool breath into his lungs. He was certain another 10 seconds and he would have lost consciousness. How the women were able to breathe normally was a mystery, not to mention how Loretta could see well enough out the window to drive.
"Oh, that's much better,"
she said as the swirling air cleaned out the rest of the car.
"Copper!"
Lorraine barked, and the pair of them sat straight and alert in their seats as they passed a police car parked at a crossroads. At the sound of the siren starting after them, Gerard began plotting how he might run the rest of the way to Culloden without the officer thinking he was fleeing from a crime. But Loretta raised a hand, wiggled her fingers like she was bidding someone farewell, and the siren suddenly stopped. Gerard twisted in his seat in time to see the police car turning around in the road to head in the opposite direction. He chuckled. I often wonder if this is all just a dream brought about by my need to keep my memories clear. Lorraine looked over her shoulder.
"Why is that?"
Because ye two cannot have the powers to do what I believe you've done. The sisters laughed. Then Loretta shook her head.
"Not us, laddie. It's our brother who holds the power of an entire generation of Muirs in his hands. All we can do is read a thought or two, see a glimpse of the future now and again, and make things appear a bit cheerier than they might truly be."
Her sister put an elbow to her ribs, and she glowered.
"Don't be confessing our sins, sister,"
said Lorraine. This brother of yours.
"You've met Wickham, dear."
That surprised him. But he's a young man. He thought best not to finish that comment, but Loretta just laughed.
"Well, if we're 100 this year, that puts him at 81, if you're counting."
Lorraine elbowed her again. Loretta harumphed.
"It's not as if he's much longer for this world, is it?"
The truth of her words struck him in the chest. She's right, he said. My mind has been on other things. He forced a smile to his lips. But at least I won't have to inhale any more hairspray, aye. His stomach rolled over when they passed a sign pointing to the battlefield, and he could feel his bones stirring, as if they'd sensed they were near their final resting place, like a horse turned for home. Of course, any number of things might happen once he placed his foot upon the grounds again. Sonny had said in the beginning that they wouldn't be returning after their quests were over, and there he was, feeling her again.
"Beaties."
Lorraine gave him a wink.
"You're still entirely mortal, Ross."
He wasn't so sure. He'd remembered his hand passing through Jamie on the hillside. They pulled up the drive, and as the battlefield and the memorial cairn came into view, Gerard was struck by how deserted the place appeared. A few folks wandered in and out of the great visitor centre, and 3 small groups wandered down to the Jacobite front lines, but the remainder of Culloden's 79 were gone. And only in a day, he whispered.
You see? I told you you're still mortal. That's why you can't see them, and why they'll take little notice of you."
He looked again. Still nothing. But what was more, there was no sign of Assa. They pulled into a stall in the car park.
"She's probably inside,"
one of the sisters suggested, as if she'd read his thoughts. Inside? Few of his comrades ever went inside. Every imaginable reminder of their defeat was within those walls, and a blood-curdling battle room awaited any brave enough to live through the slaughter again. But witnessing the original had been bad enough to keep them all away. Only the bravest went inside. And if Assa was inside, that delicate butterfly wing shielding her from her memories would not last long. Assa, who could no longer bear the slightest bit of violence. He bolted toward the doors, gave no thought to running inside the gauntlet of horror, and was stopped by a hand on his chest. "You'll have to pay an entrance fee, sir." The security officer acted as if he'd never seen Gerard before in his life, when he'd been walking past the man nearly every day for 6 years. "Alan," Gerard said, "let me pass, or I'll tell Anita what ye keep beneath the seat in the out-of-service buggy, my." The man's face contorted in a mixture of horror and confusion. Gerard took advantage and pushed past him. He hurried up the aisles that held placards and trinkets along each wall. He glanced away from a targe here, a dagger there. The sight of a bayonet nearly emptied his stomach, and he suddenly realized why Assa had an aversion to violence. She'd witnessed too much of it already, whether or not she remembered the details. Mortals were ill-equipped for such trauma. "Assa," he reminded himself. "Find Assa." He had to stop for a deep breath before he was able to push the door open to the battle room. A man stood in the centre with his arms wrapped around a woman's shoulders while they both took in the sight of 40 minutes of 360 degrees of horror consolidated into 5 minutes of reenactment. Gerard kept his eyes away from the walls where the moving pictures were projected. "No one else in the room. Get out." He followed the course through to the weapons room, where a large table laid out the history of the place in miniature. A man lectured a small mob of schoolchildren on what went wrong during the battle, when, in truth, it was what happened before the battle that doomed them all. "Not inside. She's not inside." Unless the lass was in the loo where he dared not look for her, she wasn't in the building. And why had he seen nothing of Jackie? When he stumbled out the doors and took a deep breath, he realized the air-conditioned interior had been as toxic to him as a cloud of hairspray. But he was all right. He was out. And Assa hadn't been cowering in a corner somewhere, paralyzed by the violence not only on display, but hiding in her mind. He glanced toward the corner and found the Muir sisters just coming from the car park. Unfortunately, between them walked one of the dearest and dreaded women in his life, Sansaray. He stepped out onto the grass and strode in the opposite direction. He heard his name, but didn't know if one of the women was calling out to him or just talking about him, so he kept going. South, and to the left a bit, he headed for the blue flag that marked the far right flank of the Jacobite line. There, Gerard had once delivered a message to Lord John Murray from Alistair McMaster Alistair, leader of the Clanranald regiment, not long before the first shot signalled the start of the battle. Unlike his ghostly years, to walk upon that ground again in human form filled his stomach with fresh remorse, but he had no time for that. From there, he turned right onto the path that led down the Jacobite line, and, to his relief, the lovely head of red hair, for which he'd always kept an eye out, lingered at the Cameron Memorial. It was where 79 Simon McLaren often sat, and Gerard laughed to himself, imagining the man sitting there now, while his Assa blocked his view of the rise beyond. Her head snapped to the side, and after she saw Gerard, she bolted, just as his Kennedy had done 1,000 times, her copper mane bouncing behind her instead of that damnable cap. Powerless to resist such a lure, Gerard took off after her, determined to feel the touch of her lips one last time. Chapter 16. "Wait, Assa, wait!" Gerard shot out after the lass, knowing from experience that she would keep running, and in circles if necessary, until he finally gave up and let her be. But he wasn't going to give up this time. They were both mortal for the moment, and he was fairly certain he could outlast her. The lass was fast, however, and she was nearly to the car park again before he finally caught up with her. No doubt 60 ghosts had been roused from their thoughts to watch the spectacle, but he didn't care. He had to speak with her before Sonny snatched him away. "Assa, forgive me." He clamped his hand around her upper arm and dragged her to a stop. She struggled to loosen his grip, but couldn't, and while she gasped for breath, she kept her face away from him. "No need, lass. I've seen your face. I ken who you are. No more need to hide from me,"
I don't know what you mean.
she said, but he suspected she was lying. The chase had been too familiar. She'd known just what she was doing. "Assa, my love, forgive me,"
Forgiven.
she said, still not facing him.
Now let me go.
"Nay, lass, I need real forgiveness before I'm taken away." Her head snapped around again.
What do you mean?
"I've only a few more minutes on this earth. I would have your forgiveness before I go, or I swear I shall never know peace." She took the smallest step toward him.
Who says you must go? I do.
Sonny stood near the large stone wall lining the walkway. The pavement at her feet was a checkerboard of stones, honouring those who had donated to keep the battlefield intact. She toed the stone inscribed with the name of the actor, Gerard Butler, as if reminding him that it was his time to go. But she kept her hands in the pockets of her black robe and made no movement toward him. Gerard gave the wee witch a smile and a wink of thanks. To Assa he said, "Do ye remember your promise to me on the Keswick ferry?" She shook her head, frowning.
Keswick Ferry?
He reached out and pushed a lock of hair away from her forehead, wishing he could do the same to that butterfly wing. "Aye, ye offered me forgiveness, and I asked ye to keep it for me, that it need a whole pocketful, and you should hold on to it until I asked for it." She smiled at the sentiment, surely, and not from actual memory. "I told ye to hold on to it like a pebble in your pocket, and I gave ye a wee pebble for a reminder." Assa's eyes widened, and she dug into the pocket of her denims.
A white pebble?
And to his complete joy, she produced the same rock he'd once carried in his sporran for good luck. The very same. She held it out to him. He shook his head. "Dinna give it unless you mean it, lass. A grant of forgiveness, and perhaps give me a wee kiss so I believe it's real." She bit her lip and said nothing while she turned the stone in her fingers. "I love ye, Assa or Nessa, whomever you choose to be, no matter how old you grow, no matter how wrinkled, like an ancient woman I met at a bus stop, and I'll wait for ye no matter how long in the next life, and if I must wait for your forgiveness, so be it." He swallowed the lump forming in his throat. This was farewell. Again. Just as he'd left her at Dunvegan. Just as she'd left him from Culloden 2 weeks before. Only this time, he knew who he was leaving. Assa pulled his hand open and firmly pressed the stone into it, closed his fingers over it, and lifted up on her toes to press her lips to his.
Forgiven?
She said clearly, and kissed him again. He wouldn't have been surprised if it took a security guard and 3 Muir witches to pull them apart again. He was home. He was loved. He held the entire world in his arms, and only death itself could take it away from him again. Somewhere in the distance, a lass cleared her throat, then waited a wee while before doing so a second time. If he hadn't been out of breath, he would have ignored her forever. Damn his mortal body anyway. He spared Sonny a frown.
I realised what I promised Gerard Ross.
Sonny wouldn't meet his gaze.
But something happened, do you see? And I can no longer send you on to heaven.
It was a blow, but he understood. No doubt he'd committed all manner of blasphemies since he'd fallen on the moor that day in 1746 and before. Sonny noted his disappointment and shook her head quickly.
What I mean is, someone made a sacrifice on your behalf. Nearly 2 weeks past, actually. Sacrifice?
Assa clutched at his shoulders.
2 weeks?
Gerard looked at the love of his life. What had she done? Sonny continued.
Aye. And, well, I'm sorry if you'd like to have done with this world, but it seems you're staying.
Staying?
Aye.
Sonny shrugged.
But Kennedy is a different story.
Wait, dinna say it. Whatever the wee witch was about to decree could not be good. If she were set on taking Assa away from him, he couldn't bear it. Alive or dead, he'd be condemned to hell. But if one of them could stay... The lass is young and fine, and has the world ahead of her, a life she's already begun again. Let her stay, and take me instead, aye. I'm not so used to my skin and bones that I'd miss them much in any case.
No.
Assa shook her head frantically at Sonny.
I don't know what you're talking about, but don't listen to him.
Her memory, of course. An idea struck Gerard, and though he couldn't bear to look away from Assa, he spoke to Sansaray. Tell me, do you have the power over memory like your uncle? Can you make her forget me? Forget all of it? Sonny shook her head.
No, but Wickham can. He can come quickly.
Assa jumped back and out of reach.
No, I don't want to forget you.
He smiled into her eyes. I promise, I'll remember all of it, for both of us. He swallowed again and looked away from the tears gathering in Assa's eyes. To Sonny he said, Call him. Sonny laughed.
Gerard Ross, I knew I could count on you to do the noble thing.
Noble or not, leaving Assa again would likely prove more difficult than joining up with Clanranald, even when he suspected he would die for doing it. He finally faced the lass again and opened his arms. Let me hold you a wee while longer, Assa.
No need,
Sonny said.
I cannot take either of you now. Your offer of sacrifice was all I needed, my friends. Mortal ye are, and mortal you'll stay. Though I cannot know how long your lives will be. Mortal?
Assa shook her head, confused.
Aye.
Sonny gave him a tearful smile.
So you can hold her all you wish.
Gerard strode quickly to his precious Sonny, lifted her into the air and swung her around in circles. You mean it? This is what you had in mind for us all along? For all the 79? She grinned and nodded, holding on for dear life, until he lowered her back to her feet again. Thank you, Sonny. Thank you from the bottom of my very foolish heart. He held on to one hand and held the other out to Assa, but his dearest love hesitated. He frowned at Sonny again. Do you need to call Wickham, or are you able to remove that stubborn butterfly's wing from her memory? Sonny laughed, gave Assa a wink and nodded.
Done.
Just like that. He studied the lass's face for a sudden sign of understanding, but instead of running into his arms, she backed away, slowly. He advanced, step for step, refusing to allow her to put any more distance between them. Assa Kennedy, he said carefully, what are you thinking? Was she remembering something he hadn't foreseen? Remember Dunvegan? Haven't I come looking for you, just as I promised? She finally stopped, but held out a hand and waved him back. He retreated a few steps. His heart stood on a crumbling ledge, threatening to plunge into a rocky sea if she rejected him, as he feared she was about to do. He dared not breathe. She looked to Sonny and shrugged.
I don't know who I'm supposed to be.
Sonny smiled and shook her head.
And I don't know what to tell you.
Gerard swallowed a lump of emotion, blocking his throat, along with an equally bothersome bit of pride, and opened his arms to her again. "Perhaps," he said, "if you trust me, you can start with who you're supposed to love." Assa quirked an eyebrow.
I don't know. I've already loved you for centuries. Isn't that enough?
One day more, aye, just one day more should do it. She laughed and took a step forward. His heart stumbled and started beating again.
And I suppose tomorrow you'll ask me the same favour?
She tilted her head in mock exasperation. He nodded quickly. "Aye, my love, and every day thereafter." She pointed her chin at his uplifted arms.
Aren't those great arms of yours getting heavy?
"Nay, I'll hold them open for as long as it takes."
Well then.
After a hop and a skip, she ran into his arms, lunging at the end so he had to catch her. Sonny laughed. Assa gave him only the briefest kiss and looked into his eyes.
Gerard Ross, you're a blind man if you never recognise me. Nearly 300 years.
With another kiss he put a stop to his very first lecture from his future wife. And when it worked so well, he decided he'd use the strategy whenever he could. She pulled back after a moment.
I love you, Gerard Ross. It was the only thing I never truly forgot.
Sonny cleared her throat again.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but Assa is not quite finished here.
Chapter 17. Assa's joy was short-lived. After all the turning and stretching her mind had done that day, she didn't know if she could handle another surprise from her magic friend, and reluctantly, fearing she would have her beloved Highlander taken from her again, she finally let go of him and turned to face her fate. Mortal, together. Sonny had already pronounced it, hadn't she? The witch pointed to the car park where Jackie and her 3 cousins stood beside the old lorry, and the rest of her memory slid into place. Tears rushed to her eyes, and she flung her arms wide, hoping they would come to her, for she certainly couldn't see clearly enough to go to them. The 4 hurried to her with grins on their faces, and something akin to regret in their eyes. Jackie hugged her first. "Love ye, sister mine." He pressed a kiss on her cheek and stepped back to let her cousins do the same. When she finally released Jimmy, the 4 stood in a line again. She turned to Sonny.
How can I thank you for giving my kin back to me?
Sonny scrunched up her face.
Oh, I'm afraid I couldn't do that. My bargain was for 79 lives restored, and only so many days. Without a sacrifice, the others wouldn't be so lucky. As for your kin,
She smiled at the 4, who grinned back at her.
they were eager to make amends for the years you spent on the moor. Angry with them for not heeding your warnings.
The boys all nodded vigorously.
But I'm afraid the embraces you just shared with them is all I could manage. A few seconds is all. For the past 2 weeks, you might have noticed they haven't touched you much. They've had the power to move things, but had no physical contact. I think they would have liked to give Gerard here a sound thrashing if they had been able.
Everyone laughed, including Gerard, whose hands fidgeted against his sides. She hoped it meant he couldn't wait to get a hold of her again, and not that he wanted to beat her kin bloody.
Go on, laddies. Blow her a kiss, for ye must away now.
"I'll always watch o'er ye, sister." Jackie blew her a kiss, then gave Gerard a glare. "Take better care of her, Ross, else you'll hear from me again." "I swear it," the man said, then stepped up behind her and wrapped his arms around her middle. Ian, Hughie and Jamie blew her kisses too, and they all began fading from sight. At the last second, Ian tried to step forward with a mock frown for Gerard. "And keep your arse covered, mon. Have you no shame?" She could hear the rumble of their laughter long after they were all gone. Gerard gave her a squeeze, but said nothing, giving her the moment to come to grips with losing them all over again.
You'll find the land and the house have come down through Kennedy hands and into yours. I hope you like filberts.
She glanced at the car park.
And old, ugly trucks.
With her heart full to overflowing and her eyes temporarily dry, she turned in Gerard's arms and looked into his cherished face.
A fine dowry, I would think. An entire farm and a lorry, aye?
He lifted a brow. "Is that a proposal, my love?"
Och no, you'll have to do it proper, once you have a ring and a real stone.
He grinned and stepped back from her, reached in his sporran and pulled out the white translucent rock. "It's a start, is it no?" She rolled her eyes and let him kiss her anyway.
You're going to need a great deal of training, I can tell already. Och, and a pair of glasses besides.
"Glasses? Are you saying I'm blind, my gentle Assa?"
I am at that, and if you must know, I prefer Nessa, for I find I'm not really the gentle type.
She took a hold of his ear and pulled his head closer.
Let me show you what I mean.
And with a kiss, she did. Epilogue. "Not come on his arse, Aggie," Gerard shouted from the sideline, where he was in danger of being banned from the football fields altogether. His daughter, wee Aggie, whom he and Nessa had adopted, along with her younger brother and baby sister, was trying to get her foot on the ball, but a larger boy was determined to keep it to himself. Nessa stumped over to Gerard and pressed the baby into his arms. He grunted, "Nessa, lass, I cannot coach our daughter very well with a babe in my arms, aye." She smiled up into his face.
Exactly, for she's already got a coach, aye?
She gestured in the direction of the very capable and cool-headed man who volunteered to coach the team of 6-year-olds. Wee Georgie ran up to his mother and threw himself at her legs. It was a good thing she was braced for it, or she might have toppled over. The poor laddie wouldn't let her out of his sight these days, for a number of reasons, but mostly because he was afraid she'd disappear on him, as his deceased parents had. Assa's dearest friend and her husband had been killed in a car wreck in a freak winter storm. The second biggest reason Georgie clung to Nessa was his age. He was 4. She picked up the boy as an excuse to keep Gerard from handing the baby back, and finally her husband turned his attention to the game again. Maggie had the ball in her control and raced down the field toward the nervous goalie. The big boy ran past her, cut her off, and took the ball. When she fell, her face struck the ground hard enough to make her head bounce. Every parent on the sidelines gasped. Nessa took a step toward the field, but Gerard's hand stopped her. They both held their breath and waited to see what Aggie would do. Once she started crying, it was hard to get her to stop, and they were trying not to baby her, even though there was every reason in the world to do so. "Aggie's okay," Georgie said, and pointed. "Uncle Jackie's got her." Nessa met Gerard's gaze behind their son's back. Then, together, they looked at their daughter who, except for the goalie, was alone at her end of the field. But she climbed to her feet, and after she wiped some grass off her mouth, she ran back into the fray with a smile on her face and a bit of dirt on her chin. Nessa was careful to sound casual when she put the question to Georgie.
You know Uncle Jackie?
Georgie nodded. The memories of Culloden had all but disappeared, as if their lives before the battle had come forward to join with their current lives. But she still remembered enough to know that her brother, Jackie, had been killed on Culloden Moor, and there was nothing at all left of the man but the memories she was able to hold on to, and certainly not a picture. Gerard's eyes widened.
And do you see Jackie now?
Nah, said the boy. He comes and goes, whether it's a kilt like Daz.
I see.
Nessa tried again.
And does he talk to you?
Georgie nodded. Tells me I'm very brave, like you, Mum. Gerard looked a bit insulted. Nothing about me. Georgie grinned at him. Sure. Gerard brightened. He says I'm to take pity on ye for not being a Kennedy. The boy frowned. What's pity mean? Nessa laughed, giddy over the conversation, down over her husband being insulted by the ghost of her brother, and teary to think that Jackie was near, and he was watching over her and her family as he'd promised to do. With wet eyes, Gerard gave her a wink to say none of it had been lost on him. Then he looked into Georgie's face, sober as a priest. It means, son, that you must love me extra much, aye. Georgie leaned so far that Nessa nearly dropped him, but held tight so he could kiss his dad's whiskered cheek. Then they all turned to watch the field again. She and her husband then leaned against each other, since they couldn't spare their hands, silently communicating that they would much rather be wrapped in each other's arms. Nessa wondered if Gerard was watching for as many members of the family as she was. This has been Gerard, The Ghosts of Culloden Moor, Book 15. Written by L. Muir. Narrated by Andrew McDermott and Jenn McGuirk. Copyright 2015-2016 by Leslie Muir Lytle. Production copyright by Leslie Muir Lytle.